Before the beaches, before the Armada, before the headlines that would define a generation, there were men standing in the dark, waiting for a green light. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the war over Normandy began not on the sand, but in the sky. Inside transport aircraft vibrating over the English Channel, paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division stood shoulder to shoulder under red lights. Weighed down with equipment, rehearsing the same thought every airborne soldier knows but never says aloud. Once you step out, you are on your own. The 82nd had jumped before. Sicily had scattered them across miles of countryside. Italy had hardened them. But Normandy was different. This was not a raid, not a limited objective. It was the opening move of the liberation of Western Europe. And the division's mission was clear in concept and chaotic in reality. Drop behind enemy lines, seize key bridges and roadways, block German reinforcements, and hold long enough for the invasion on the beaches to survive. The planning was meticulous. The execution was anything but. As aircraft crossed the French coastline, anti-aircraft fire erupted upward, slicing through formations and breaking up carefully arranged flight paths. Pilots maneuvered violently. Paratroopers were dropped too early, too late, too far east, too far west. Units meant to land together were scattered into flooded fields, orchards, marshes, and village streets where the enemy was already awake. The ground did not welcome them. Many landed alone. Some lost their weapons. Some never found their units again. But airborne doctrine had always assumed chaos. The 82nd did not wait for perfect assembly. Small groups formed instinctively, guided by whoever could lead in that moment. Objectives were pursued not by organized battalions, but by handfuls of determined men moving toward gunfire, toward crossroads, toward bridges that had to be taken or destroyed. The town of Sainte-Mère-Église became one of the division's earliest and most symbolic objectives. Fighting erupted in the streets before dawn, paratroopers clearing buildings one by one. By sunrise, the town was in American hands, one of the first liberated communities in France. Yet, victory there did not mean safety. German counterattacks began forming almost immediately. Bridges over the Merderet River were critical. Without them, the western flank of the invasion would remain vulnerable. The 82nd fought bitterly to secure crossings under constant threat of isolation. Units held ground while cut off. Ammunition ran low. Communications were unreliable. What mattered was not holding perfectly aligned positions. It was preventing German armor from reaching the beaches in time. The terrain amplified every challenge. Normandy's hedgerows turned fields into enclosed battle spaces. Marshlands flooded by German defenses restricted movement and trapped equipment. Visibility was limited. Every road junction mattered. Every farmhouse could conceal resistance. And yet, despite dispersion and uncertainty, the 82nd achieved its essential objectives. German reinforcements were delayed. Key routes were blocked. The western edge of the invasion zone stabilized enough for forces landing at Utah Beach to consolidate their position. And then what began in fragmentation slowly formed into structure. D-Day is often remembered through the lens of the beaches, the surf, the cliffs, the relentless gunfire from fortified positions. But without the airborne divisions, including the 82nd, the landings might have faced far greater pressure from organized counterattacks. The 82nd's role was not to be seen. It was to disrupt, confuse, and hold long enough for something larger to take root. Their success was not clean, it was improvised, it was costly, it was earned through small unit decisions made without guidance from higher command. The history of the 82nd Airborne on D-Day is not a story of flawless coordination. It is a story of adaptability under fracture, of men scattered across hostile terrain who understood that waiting for order was less important than acting with purpose. It is the story of a division that entered France in pieces and still managed to shape the outcome of the largest amphibious invasion in history. They did not land together, but they fought as if they had. This is the history of the 82nd Airborne on D-Day, the soldiers who fell into darkness and helped secure the dawn. Fort Bragg, North Carolina. August 15th, 1942. General William C. Lee stood in a sweltering assembly hall and watching 8,236 men who had just become part of an experiment nobody fully understood. They wore standard Army uniforms because airborne uniforms didn't exist yet. They carried equipment designed for infantry because airborne equipment hadn't been invented. Outside, a fleet of aircraft sat grounded because nobody had written the manual for how to use them in combat. Lee held a single sheet of paper containing his orders: activate the 82nd Airborne Division. What that actually meant, nobody could say with certainty. These soldiers had volunteered for something called airborne duty, based on recruiting posters that showed men jumping from planes with parachutes. Most had never seen a parachute except in photographs. Private James Summers, a farm boy from Oklahoma, who everyone called Red because of his hair, wrote home 3 days after arriving at Fort Bragg. His letter survives in the National Archives. "Dear Ma," it read, "I volunteered for airborne, whatever that means. They say we'll jump out of planes behind enemy lines. They haven't told us how yet because they're still figuring it out." Red sealed the envelope and walked to mail call, passing a bulletin board where training schedules should have been posted. The board was blank. The training program didn't exist because nobody had written it. The 82nd wasn't a new division. It was a ghost brought back to uncertain life. The original 82nd had been a distinguished infantry division in World War I, fighting in the Meuse-Argonne offensive before being deactivated in 1919. Thus, for 23 years, it existed only on paper and in the memories of aging veterans. Now the Army had resurrected the designation and attached it to something unprecedented: a full division of paratroopers. But calling them paratroopers was generous. In August 1942, the entire United States military possessed exactly 4 airborne regiments with actual jump training. The rest of the 82nd consisted of shuffled infantry units, artillerymen who'd never jumped, support personnel who'd never seen combat, and officers who'd graduated from Fort Benning's parachute course just weeks earlier. Fort Benning, Georgia, had opened its parachute training program only in May 1941, 9 months before the 82nd's activation. The program itself was experimental, based partially on German techniques observed in newsreels and partially on educated guesses about how human bodies might survive repeated jumps from aircraft. Early results were not encouraging. Training casualties ran at 3.2% before soldiers ever saw enemy fire. Men broke ankles on hard Georgia clay. Parachutes malfunctioned because the designs were still being refined. Equipment harnesses failed because nobody knew exactly how much stress a falling human body would place on canvas straps. When the 82nd arrived at Fort Benning for its first division-level jump exercise in March 1943, the chaos revealed just how unprepared everyone was. The exercise was designated Operation Husky, named after the upcoming invasion of Sicily. All planners envisioned the entire division dropping in coordinated waves across a designated area, assembling quickly, and moving to objectives. What actually happened became a case study in failure. Aircraft arrived late because maintenance crews were still learning how to service them properly. Jumpers landed in swamps because drop zones had been selected from maps without ground reconnaissance. Equipment bundles separated from paratroopers, leaving soldiers on the ground without weapons or radios. 2 men died when their main chutes failed and their reserve chutes tangled. General Lee watched from a command post as his vision of airborne warfare dissolved into confusion. That night, he wrote a handwritten memo to Army Ground Forces Headquarters. The memo's language was blunt. Recommend intensive study of airborne warfare methods before committing to further large-scale operations. Life magazine published a feature article about airborne training in April 1943. The headline called Paratroopers, the most dangerous soldiers America is training. The article included photographs of men tumbling from aircraft, parachutes blossoming against blue skies. It described the physical demands, the mental toughness required, the elite status these soldiers supposedly represented. But the article's headline contained an ambiguity that worried some officers. Dangerous to whom? To the enemy, certainly, if airborne operations worked as planned, but also dangerous to themselves, given the training casualty rates. And potentially dangerous to overall Allied strategy if a full division could be destroyed in a single failed operation. The volunteers themselves came from varied backgrounds, united mainly by youth and a desire to prove something. The average age was 22. Some came from farms where jumping from haylofts seemed like adequate preparation. Others came from cities where they had never seen open sky without buildings framing it. A few were college-educated men seeking officer commissions. Many were escaping poverty, drawn by the $50 extra monthly pay that paratroopers received. The bonus was called jump pay, though in 1942 it might more accurately have been called experimental pay for participating in a military concept that might fail catastrophically. They signed documents acknowledging the risks, and then climbed into transport aircraft piloted by crews who were learning navigation as they flew. General Lee believed airborne forces could achieve surprise so complete that enemy defenses would collapse before organizing resistance. His operational philosophy centered on one principle: vertical envelopment. Traditional warfare required armies to advance horizontally across defended terrain, suffering casualties at every obstacle. Airborne forces could drop behind those obstacles, seizing objectives before defenders knew they were under attack. The theory was elegant. The practice remained unproven. Germany had demonstrated airborne concepts in Crete in 1941, but at devastating cost. German paratroopers suffered 40% casualties taking the island. Hence, Hitler reportedly declared afterward that the age of airborne operations had ended. Lee studied the Crete operation and reached the opposite conclusion. Airborne operations could succeed if executed differently than the Germans had attempted. By late 1943, the 82nd had grown into a formation of over 13,000 soldiers. They'd completed hundreds of training jumps. They'd practiced night operations, equipment drops, assembly procedures. They'd learned to pack parachutes, to check harnesses obsessively, to land without breaking bones. They'd memorized radio frequencies and map coordinates. They'd qualified with weapons and explosives. On paper, they were ready for combat. But everyone from General Lee to Private Summers understood that paper readiness differed fundamentally from combat reality. Yeah, training jumps happened over friendly territory with medical personnel standing by. Combat jumps would happen over enemy territory where medical help meant surviving long enough to find a medic who had survived his own landing. The difference between those two scenarios contained all the uncertainty that defined the 82nd in 1943. The division that trained through 1943 was attempting something unprecedented in American military history. Airborne operations had existed in limited forms, but never at division scale. Never with the expectation that 8,000 men would drop from the sky, organize in darkness, and fight as a cohesive force without ground support. The volunteers knew they were experimental soldiers. They knew the equipment was experimental. They knew the tactics were experimental. What they didn't know, and couldn't know until combat tested every assumption, was whether any of it would actually work. General Lee's memo recommending further study had been filed and largely ignored. The invasion of Europe was coming. The 82nd Airborne Division would jump into France whether the experimental phase was complete or not. In the barracks at Fort Bragg, men like Red Summers wrote letters home, checked their parachutes one more time, and waited to discover if they were the elite force the recruiting posters promised or the dangerous experiment the Life magazine headline implied. Fort Benning, Georgia, November 1939. Colonel William C. Lee sat alone in a darkened room, watching flickering images on a small screen. The film was German newsreel footage, obtained through neutral diplomatic channels, AIM showing Fallschirmjäger paratroopers dropping into Poland. The footage quality was poor, the camera work shaky, but Lee watched with intensity that bordered on obsession. He rewound the reel and watched again, and again. The sequence showed German soldiers tumbling from Junkers aircraft, parachutes deploying, men landing and immediately engaging Polish defenders. The entire operation lasted minutes. Lee saw not propaganda, but possibility. While most American officers dismissed parachute troops as German theatrics unsuited to serious warfare, Lee saw the future. William Carey Lee was 50 years old in 1939, old enough to have fought in World War I, young enough to believe another war was coming. He'd graduated from Virginia Military Institute in 1908 with a degree in military science, then spent 30 years in an army that changed slowly when it changed at all. Lee had studied under George Marshall at the infantry school, absorbing Marshall's emphasis on maneuver over attrition. While other officers focused on fortifications and artillery, Lee became fascinated with mobility. How could armies move faster than their enemies could respond? How could surprise be achieved in an age of radio communication and aerial reconnaissance? The German newsreel offered an answer: bypass enemy defenses entirely by arriving from above. Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941. 48 hours later, Lee was in Washington presenting a proposal to Army leadership. The nation was reeling from the Pacific disaster, scrambling to mobilize for two-front war. And here was a colonel suggesting they create an entirely new type of combat division based on German techniques. The proposal should have been rejected as impractical wartime experimentation. Instead, Marshall remembered his former student and asked a single question. "Can it be done by summer?" Lee answered without hesitation. "Yes, if we start immediately." He left Washington with authorization to form one experimental airborne division. He had 8 months to invent American airborne warfare from nothing. Lee took command of the newly activated 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg in August 1942. His first order established the philosophy that would define the division. We will train like we fight, isolated, independent, behind enemy lines. The order created immediate problems. Standard Army training assumed units would operate with artillery support, armor support, supply lines, and communication with higher headquarters. Lee's order eliminated all those assumptions. His paratroopers would drop alone, fight alone, and survive alone until ground forces reached them. If they couldn't operate independently, they were useless. This philosophy derived from Lee's understanding of maneuver warfare theory, concepts that were 20 years ahead of mainstream Army doctrine. He was asking soldiers to become self-sufficient combat units, capable of making tactical decisions without orders, holding positions without reinforcement, and achieving objectives without support. The training regimen Lee designed was punishing. Standard Army training required soldiers to complete 5 qualifying jumps before earning jump wings. Lee required his men to complete 147 jumps before he considered them combat ready. Other nations' paratroopers averaged 8 to 10 training jumps. Lee's men jumped every week for months, in daylight and darkness, in good weather and bad, carrying full combat loads. They jumped over forests, over water, over open fields. They jumped in stick formations where 30 men exited a single aircraft in 18 seconds. They practiced assembly procedures until they could form combat units in complete darkness. The training killed men. Parachutes failed. Aircraft crashed. Soldiers misjudged landings and broke bones. Lee attended every funeral, read every casualty report, and never reduced the training tempo. He believed that every man who died in training represented lessons that would save lives in combat. And Fort Bragg during Lee's command became a laboratory for airborne warfare concepts that didn't exist elsewhere. Lee worked with equipment manufacturers to design parachutes that could carry heavier loads. He collaborated with Douglas Aircraft to modify their DC-3 civilian transport into the C-47 military variant with jump doors and reinforced floors. He experimented with different drop altitudes, testing whether lower jumps reduced exposure to enemy fire, enough to justify higher injury rates on landing. He developed hand signals and light signals for aircraft formations flying in darkness. He created equipment bundles that could be dropped separately from soldiers, landing containers filled with machine guns, mortars, medical supplies. Every innovation emerged from Lee's fundamental question: What would paratroopers need to survive and fight independently behind enemy lines? General Dwight Eisenhower visited Fort Bragg in March 1944 to observe airborne training and discuss the upcoming invasion of Europe. Lee briefed him on the 82nd's capabilities and his vision for vertical envelopment of German defenses. The briefing described airborne forces dropping inland from invasion beaches, seizing bridges and crossroads, cutting German communication lines, creating chaos in rear areas. Eisenhower listened carefully, asked detailed questions about casualty estimates and link-up timelines, then wrote in his diary that night, "Lee's ideas are bold, perhaps too bold. His confidence in these men is absolute. I hope his confidence is justified." The entry revealed Eisenhower's uncertainty about committing thousands of soldiers to an operation that remained fundamentally experimental. But Eisenhower also recognized that seizing defended beaches required every possible advantage. If airborne forces could prevent German reinforcements from reaching the coast, the invasion might succeed. Without that disruption, it might fail. Fort Bragg, May 20th, 1944. Lee stood reviewing his division during a full-dress parade. Thousands of paratroopers marched past, equipment polished, bearing sharp. Lee had transformed a collection of infantry regiments into what he believed was the finest airborne division in the world. Officers who'd trained under him now commanded regiments. Soldiers who'd made their first jumps terrified now jumped routinely. The division was ready. Lee was ready. And then, midway through the review, he felt pressure in his chest. His vision blurred. He stumbled, caught himself, continued standing. The pressure increased. Lee later described it as feeling like his chest was being crushed in a vice. His aide noticed Lee swaying and called for medics. They loaded him into an ambulance and rushed him to base hospital. The diagnosis came within hours. Massive heart attack. Lee's war was over before combat began. Lee's doctors had known about his heart condition for months. So had Army leadership. The medical data exists in his personnel file, documenting elevated blood pressure, chest pains, shortness of breath during physical exertion. They'd kept him in command anyway because nobody else understood airborne doctrine the way Lee did. His vision had created the 82nd. His training had prepared them. His philosophy would guide them, even in his absence. But Lee would not jump with them into Normandy. He would not see his theories tested in combat. From his hospital bed in late May 1944, Lee wrote his last order concerning the invasion. It dealt with drop zone selection, recommending specific alterations based on recent reconnaissance. The order was filed, Lee's handwriting growing weaker near the end, and then William Carey Lee's direct influence on the 82nd Airborne Division ended. The man who'd believed in wings would watch from a hospital room, while other men flew into battle. The division Lee created was unlike any other in the American military. It combined conventional infantry tactics with unconventional insertion methods. It emphasized individual initiative while maintaining unit cohesion. It prepared soldiers for isolation while training them to operate collectively. These contradictions reflected Lee's understanding that airborne warfare required different thinking. A soldier dropped behind enemy lines couldn't wait for orders from headquarters because headquarters might be 50 miles away. He had to assess situations, make decisions, take action. Lee's training either produced soldiers capable of that independence or it produced soldiers who would freeze under pressure. The 82nd contained both types. And which type would prevail in actual combat remained unknown when Lee's heart failed in May 1944. His successor would inherit not just a division, but a philosophy that was either visionary or fatally flawed. The invasion would reveal which. Douglas Aircraft Factory, Santa Monica, California, February 19, 1942. Engineers stood around a DC-3 civilian airliner, studying blueprints and arguing about modifications. The DC-3 was a successful commercial transport, carrying passengers in relative comfort across American skies. Now, the military wanted it converted into a parachute delivery system. The changes seemed straightforward on paper. Remove passenger seats, reinforce the floor, install a cargo door large enough for equipped soldiers to exit in rapid succession. In practice, every modification created new problems. The civilian door was too small. Widening it weakened the fuselage. Reinforcing the fuselage added weight. Added weight reduced range and payload capacity. Reduced payload capacity meant fewer soldiers per aircraft. The mathematics were unforgiving. The solution emerged through trial and error across months of testing. Engineers expanded the door frame by 18 inches and added structural reinforcements that distributed stress throughout the fuselage. They strengthened the floor with aluminum ribbing to handle soldiers wearing 80 pounds of equipment. They installed static lines above the door, cables that would automatically deploy parachutes as soldiers jumped. They tested the static line system by dropping weighted dummies, or discovering that the cables sometimes tangled if soldiers exited too quickly. After recalculating, they determined that soldiers needed to exit at intervals of exactly 0.6 of a second. Faster caused tangles. Slower meant aircraft spent too much time over drop zones, exposed to enemy fire. The C-47, as the military variant was designated, became operational in late 1942. By 1944, it was the primary airborne delivery system for American forces. But operational didn't mean perfected. Wright Field, Ohio. April 19, 1943. The first test drop of fully equipped paratroopers from a C-47 revealed problems that hadn't appeared with weighted dummies. Real soldiers moved differently than dummies. They hesitated at doors. They adjusted straps mid-jump. They collided with each other in the cramped fuselage. During one test, a soldier's equipment caught on the doorframe as he exited. He hung partially outside the aircraft, one leg still inside, while the plane continued flying at 90 miles per hour. The jumpmaster grabbed him, other soldiers grabbed the jumpmaster, and together they pulled him back inside. The soldier was uninjured but shaken. Engineers modified the doorframe again, smoothing edges, eliminating protrusions. The modifications helped but couldn't eliminate human factors. Soldiers would always be unpredictable variables in ways machines were not. The C-47's performance characteristics created tactical constraints that planners struggled to accommodate. Cruising speed was 160 miles per hour, too fast for safe parachute deployment, and pilots had to slow to 90 or 100 miles per hour for drops, a speed that felt dangerously slow to aviators accustomed to speed as survival insurance. Drop altitude was another calculation. Higher altitude gave parachutes more time to deploy properly, but exposed soldiers to longer periods of vulnerability while descending. Lower altitude reduced exposure, but increased the risk of parachute malfunction. Testing determined that 800 feet was optimal, high enough for safe deployment, low enough to minimize time under canopy. But 800 feet meant pilots had almost no margin for error. If they misjudged altitude by 100 feet, soldiers would hit ground before parachutes fully deployed. Memphis, Tennessee, 1944. Over 50,000 paratroopers cycled through C-47 familiarization training in 8 months. The training was necessary because soldiers and aircraft had to function as integrated systems. Pilots learned to fly in tight formation, aircraft separated by predetermined distances that allowed entire sticks of paratroopers to land close together. Soldiers learned to stand, hook up static lines, check equipment of the man ahead, and exit on command, all while the aircraft bounced and swayed in turbulence. They practiced until the procedures became automatic. Stand up, hook up, check equipment, sound off, go. The drill had to work in darkness, in weather, under fire. Any breakdown meant soldiers scattered across miles instead of concentrating in drop zones. Royal Air Force, Glatton, England. May 19th, 44. American pilots flew their first night navigation exercises with 82nd Airborne jumpers aboard. Navigation in daylight required constant visual reference to landmarks, rivers, roads, towns. Navigation at night reduced those references to shadowy shapes, distinguishable only in moonlight. Pilots relied on radio beacons, compass headings, and timing calculations to find drop zones. The exercises revealed horrifying inadequacies. Pilots became disoriented in cloud cover. Radio beacons sometimes transmitted weak signals, or none at all. Timing calculations assumed constant airspeed, but defensive maneuvers to avoid hypothetical anti-aircraft fire disrupted those assumptions. During one exercise, 3 aircraft collided in darkness, killing all crew and paratroopers aboard. The exercise was classified as training accident, and casualties recorded without publicity. Surviving pilots returned to training, now acutely aware that darkness and formation flying created lethal combinations. Fort Bragg maintenance logs from June 2nd, 1944, 72 hours before D-Day, documented the 82nd's allocated aircraft status. 530 C-47s were assigned to drop the division. Maintenance crews reported only 376 aircraft were fully flight-worthy. Another 89 had minor issues that might or might not cause problems during operations. 65 aircraft required major repairs that couldn't be completed before departure. The shortage resulted from cascading maintenance demands. The C-47 was manufactured by Douglas Aircraft at maximum production capacity, but over 4,000 aircraft were needed for all Allied airborne operations. Spare parts were chronically scarce. Engines wore out from intensive training flights. Hydraulic systems leaked. Electrical systems failed unpredictably. Mechanics worked 18-hour shifts, cannibalizing parts from damaged aircraft to keep operational aircraft flying. The C-47's payload capacity dictated invasion planning at the most fundamental level. Each aircraft carried 28 fully equipped paratroopers. Simple division revealed the mathematics. Dropping the 82nd's approximately 6,600 paratroopers required 236 aircraft at minimum, but combat operations required redundancy. Planners assumed 10% mechanical failure rate and another 10% for aircraft shot down. Those assumptions increased requirements to 290 aircraft. Formations needed escort fighters, Pathfinder aircraft to mark drop zones, and spare capacity for equipment bundles. The final allocation reached 530 aircraft for a single division's drop. Coordinating 530 aircraft to take off, form up, fly across the English Channel, and drop soldiers within minutes of each other pushed organizational capacity to its limits. The machines themselves were marvels of engineering, hastily adapted from peacetime purposes to wartime necessities. Douglas Aircraft had designed the DC-3 for comfort and efficiency, carrying passengers who expected smooth flights and safe landings. Those passengers never jumped from moving aircraft into hostile territory. With the C-47 inherited the DC-3's reliable engines and stable handling, but every other characteristic changed. The fuselage became a metal tube where soldiers sat on uncomfortable benches, breathing exhaust fumes and engine oil, waiting for signal lights that meant jump. The door that had welcomed civilian passengers now opened onto empty space at 800 feet. The pilots who'd flown commercial routes now navigated by dead reckoning toward objectives they had never seen, trusting that soldiers behind them would land where intended and accomplish missions that would determine whether the invasion succeeded. The C-47 was the machine that made American airborne warfare possible. It was also the machine that introduced countless new ways for operations to fail catastrophically. When the 82nd climbed aboard on June 5, 1944, they were trusting their lives to aircraft that hadn't existed 3 years earlier, flown by pilots trained for months rather than years, navigating toward drop zones mapped from photographs that might be inaccurate, landing in darkness among enemies whose positions were largely unknown. The machines were ready. Whether ready was good enough, nobody would know until morning. Fort Bragg, North Carolina, May 28, 1944. Major General Matthew B. Ridgway walked into a hospital room where General William C. Lee lay connected to monitoring equipment, face pale but mind sharp. Lee had suffered his heart attack 8 days earlier. Ridgway had been appointed his replacement 4 days earlier. Now, Lee briefed his successor on the division he'd built, speaking slowly to conserve strength, occasionally pressing hand to chest. He described his training philosophy, his operational concepts, his vision for how the 82nd would fight as an independent force behind German lines. Ridgway listened respectfully, took notes, and said nothing about the fundamental doubts forming in his mind. Lee's vision assumed airborne forces could operate independently for extended periods. Ridgway had read casualty estimates. He'd studied logistics. He thought Lee's vision was brilliant and unworkable. Matthew Bunker Ridgway was 48 years old, career infantry, 0 airborne experience. His most recent assignment had been assistant division commander of an infantry division, training for conventional ground combat. He'd graduated from West Point in 1917, too late for World War I combat. He'd spent 25 years in peacetime Army positions that emphasized administration over action. Ridgway's combat experience consisted of staff assignments and training exercises. The 82nd Airborne was his first combat command, and it was a type of unit he barely understood. Army leadership selected him because they needed someone available immediately who held appropriate rank and demonstrated competence. Ridgway was available. Whether he was appropriate remained to be determined. Fort Bragg, June 1st, 1944. Ridgway issued his first operational order to the 82nd. The order's key phrase contradicted everything Lee had taught the division. We do not operate independently. We seize and hold ground until relieved. Ridgway understood that Lee's philosophy appealed to soldiers' sense of elite status, but he also understood that isolated units without resupply would be destroyed. His order emphasized rapid link-up with ground forces advancing from invasion beaches. The 82nd would drop, secure objectives, and wait for relief by the 4th Infantry Division advancing inland. Time frame for link-up: 36 hours maximum. Lee had trained the division to operate alone for weeks. Ridgway was telling them they had less than 2 days. The divergence in philosophy reflected fundamental differences in how the two generals understood warfare. Lee was a visionary who believed airborne forces could revolutionize combat. Ridgway was a pragmatist who believed airborne forces were useful but expendable tools. Normandy headquarters, June 3rd, 1944. Ridgway met with Eisenhower to clarify invasion objectives. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Eisenhower explained that the overall plan depended on securing beach exits quickly, so armor and supplies could move inland. Airborne forces dropping behind beaches would prevent German reinforcements from reaching coastal defenses. But Eisenhower emphasized that airborne units were not sustainable without ground link-up. They carried ammunition for 1 or 2 days of intense combat. They had no artillery except mortars. They had no armor, no heavy weapons, limited medical supplies. Eisenhower's directive was explicit: seize objectives, hold until relieved, then transition to conventional infantry operations. And Ridgway left the meeting understanding that his role wasn't to implement Lee's vision, but to adapt it to operational reality. Fort Bragg, June 4th, 1944. Ridgway wrote in his personal journal an entry that reveals his uncertainty about the change in command. The men believe they are going to be behind enemy lines for weeks, operating independently as Lee trained them. They need to know they have 36 hours maximum before relief arrives, or they will take risks based on false assumptions about endurance. But if I tell them 36 hours, will they fight with the same intensity? Lee built their confidence on the idea they were elite, independent, unstoppable. I'm telling them they're valuable but temporary. How does that change their psychology? The entry was never meant for publication. Ridgway sealed the journal and placed it with personal effects. Decades later, historians would cite the passage as evidence of Ridgway's awareness that changing Lee's philosophy at the last moment might undermine morale. The doctrinal shift Ridgway implemented wasn't merely philosophical. It had tactical implications that rippled through planning. Lee's doctrine emphasized aggressive action to exploit surprise, pushing deep into enemy territory to cause maximum disruption. Ridgway's doctrine emphasized consolidation, holding key terrain rather than raiding widely. Lee had designated ambitious objectives scattered across miles. Ridgway consolidated those objectives into defensible areas near designated link-up routes. First Army staff prepared a classified analysis of the changes, as concluding that Ridgway's modifications reduced risk of encirclement by 34%, but might reduce strategic flexibility. The analysis noted that German forces would be able to identify American positions more easily if those positions were concentrated rather than dispersed. But concentrated positions would also be easier to reinforce once ground forces arrived. The trade-off reflected Ridgway's fundamental calculation. He preferred known risks to unknown ones. British 1st Airborne Division, landing simultaneously with American forces, maintained independent operation orders similar to Lee's original vision. British paratroopers expected to fight alone for 3 to 5 days, seizing and holding bridges until ground forces arrived. The British approach reflected different training, different doctrine, and different confidence in airborne sustainability. Ridgway studied British plans and concluded they were taking unnecessary risks. British commanders studied American plans and concluded Ridgway was being overly cautious. The divergent approaches meant that if operations went badly, one side would claim vindication while the other accepted blame. Ridgway was comfortable with that outcome. He preferred being accused of caution rather than recklessness. Aircraft over English Channel, June 5, 1944, 11 o'clock at night. Ridgway sat in a C-47 with elements of his command staff, reviewing operational orders one final time. The documents showed revisions in multiple hands, different colored ink indicating different planning stages. Some margins contained notes in Lee's handwriting, recommendations about drop zone approach angles and assembly areas. Ridgway read Lee's notes, considered them, then drew single lines through several. The crossed-out notes weren't wrong. They were optimistic. Lee had assumed everything would go according to plan. Ridgway assumed nothing would go according to plan and designed flexibility into every phase. Where Lee had specified exact timing for phase lines, Ridgway had added contingencies. Where Lee had designated single assembly areas, Ridgway had identified backups. The revisions represented different philosophies. Lee believed in the plan, Ridgway believed in adapting when plans failed. The soldiers Ridgway commanded had been trained under Lee's philosophy for 2 years. They'd internalized Lee's emphasis on independence and aggressive action. Or they'd practiced for missions that assumed extended operations behind enemy lines. Ridgway had 6 days to modify that mindset before combat. He couldn't retrain them. He could only clarify expectations. Officers briefed their men on revised timelines and link-up procedures. Some soldiers accepted the changes as operational refinements. Others felt confused about the contradiction between their training and their orders. A few wondered if the change reflected doubt about their capabilities. Ridgway heard rumors of declining morale and addressed them directly during final briefings. He told soldiers they were the finest division in the Army. Their training was exceptional and the mission was clear. Drop, seize objectives, hold until relieved. Period. What he didn't tell them, because it would serve no purpose, was that he considered their survival dependent on link-up within 36 hours, and that if relief didn't arrive on schedule, casualties would become catastrophic. The transition from Lee to Ridgway represented more than change in command. It represented collision between vision and pragmatism, between revolutionary warfare concepts and conventional military thinking. Lee had imagined airborne forces as game-changing capability that could win campaigns through disruption and surprise. Ridgway saw them as specialized infantry with unique insertion methods but standard vulnerabilities once on the ground. Both men were correct within their frameworks. Lee's vision would eventually shape modern special operations forces. Ridgway's pragmatism would keep the 82nd alive long enough to vindicate Lee's vision. But on June 5th, 1944, as aircraft engines roared and soldiers checked equipment one final time, the division was caught between two philosophies, trained for one mission but ordered to execute another. Which approach would prove correct depended entirely on whether the next 24 hours went according to anyone's plan. Ridgway doubted they would. He was already preparing for chaos. Royal Air Force, Medmenham, England, March 19th, 44. A Spitfire reconnaissance aircraft landed and taxied to debriefing area. The pilot climbed out exhausted from a 3-hour sortie over Normandy, flying at 25,000 feet to photograph German defensive positions. Ground crews rushed film canisters to photo intelligence unit where analysts waited with magnifying glasses and plotting tables. The photographs showed fields, hedgerows, these villages, roads. They did not show mine locations, troop positions, or communication trenches. Aerial photography from 25,000 feet captured general terrain, but missed crucial details. An analyst examining photographs of what would become Drop Zone T near Sainte-Mère-Église noted possible enemy positions, but couldn't confirm anything definitively. Ground truth remained unknowable from current position. Between March and early June 1944, reconnaissance aircraft flew 427 sorties over Normandy, accumulating thousands of photographs. Photo intelligence officers assembled the images into composite maps, showing terrain features with reasonable accuracy. Rivers appeared where maps said they should be. Roads matched pre-war French surveys. Villages were identifiable by church steeples and building clusters, but photographs couldn't reveal ground hardness, couldn't show whether fields were boggy or firm, couldn't indicate whether hedgerows were passable or impassable. The maps gave illusion of knowledge without providing information that determined whether soldiers would land safely or catastrophically. Planners worked with what they had because waiting for better intelligence meant postponing the invasion indefinitely. Bastogne Planning Chamber, April 1944. Intelligence officers marked proposed drop zones on large-scale maps spread across tables. The 82nd's assigned zones were designated Drop Zone O near Picoville, Drop Zone T near Sainte-Mère-Église, and Drop Zone N near Chef du Pont. The total area covered approximately 12 square miles of Norman countryside. No Allied soldier had set foot in that 12-square-mile area. No spy network operated there to provide current intelligence. Everything planners knew came from photographs, pre-war maps, and French civilian refugees interviewed in England who'd lived in the region years earlier. One intelligence officer asked the obvious question during planning session, "Have any of us actually been there?" Silence followed. The answer was no. Nobody had been there. The invasion would drop 6,600 paratroopers into terrain known only from aerial images and fading memories. The maps themselves revealed another problem. Standard military maps showed terrain features, elevations, obstacles. The 82nd's maps were civilian French survey maps from 1938, designed for motorists and hikers, not military operations. Elevation contours were approximate. Hedgerow locations were indicated by simple lines that gave no sense of their actual size or density. Water features were shown, but not their depths or current states. The intelligence summary acknowledged these limitations plainly. Maps were adequate for general orientation, but insufficient for tactical planning. That admission meant soldiers would jump into France knowing approximately where they were supposed to land, but uncertain about what they'd encounter upon landing. German defensive positions added layers of uncertainty that reconnaissance couldn't resolve. Analysts identified what they called Rommel's asparagus, wooden posts with explosive charges planted in fields to destroy gliders and kill paratroopers. Photographs showed these obstacles in some fields, but couldn't reveal their density or exact locations. Intelligence estimates suggested German forces in the Normandy sector numbered 25,000 troops. Actual numbers were 7,000 immediately present, but 30,000 within 24 hours marching distance. The error mattered enormously. 7,000 defenders could be overwhelmed by concentrated airborne assault. 30,000 defenders could destroy scattered paratroopers before they organized. Intelligence officers noted the discrepancy, but couldn't resolve it. German units moved frequently, use camouflage effectively, and maintain communication discipline that prevented signal intercepts. Le Havre Intelligence Summary, May 30th, 1944. Reconnaissance flights increased to 1,200 sorties per week as invasion approached. Pilots flew lower, risking anti-aircraft fire to capture detailed images. Photo analysts worked overnight shifts, processing film and updating maps continuously. Reports identified German anti-aircraft installations along likely flight paths, but couldn't confirm exact locations or gun types. Some positions appeared heavily defended, others lightly defended, many were ambiguous. The cumulative intelligence painted picture of dangerous but not impossible operation. That assessment reflected hope as much as analysis. Both intelligence officers understood their primary task wasn't identifying every threat, but determining whether the invasion was feasible. The answer, delivered upward through command chains to Eisenhower, was that invasion was feasible with acceptable risk. What acceptable risk actually meant wouldn't be known until soldiers landed. The flooded lowlands of Normandy created additional hazards that intelligence struggled to assess. Germans had deliberately flooded agricultural fields by manipulating water management systems, creating shallow lakes where fields had been. Photographs showed water but couldn't indicate depth. Was the water ankle deep or 6 feet deep? Would paratroopers landing in flooded areas be able to wade to dry ground? Or would they drown weighted down by 80 pounds of equipment? And intelligence officers consulted French agricultural experts who estimated depths based on seasonal water tables and terrain grades. The estimates were educated guesses, nothing more. Some fields would be passable, others would be death traps. Which was which, nobody could say with certainty until someone landed in them. Contrast between beach landing intelligence and airborne landing intelligence was stark. Naval forces approaching Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword beaches had charts based on 100 years of nautical surveys. Depths, currents, bottom composition, underwater obstacles, all documented with precision. Naval gunners knew exact coordinates of German fortifications, because those fortifications were visible from sea. Airborne forces had 3 months of reconnaissance photographs showing fuzzy images of fields and trees. The disparity resulted from fundamental differences in environment. Ocean topography changed slowly and had been mapped exhaustively. Land topography changed constantly through human activity and could be hidden beneath tree canopy or camouflage. The 82nd was jumping into operational blindness that naval forces didn't face. Intelligence accuracy rates, calculated after invasion from comparison of estimates to reality, showed 67% of German unit locations were wrong by more than 5 kilometers. That margin of error transformed tactical planning from precise to speculative. A German battalion estimated to be 5 kilometers east might actually be 5 kilometers west, placing it directly in drop zone instead of safely distant. Planners knew intelligence was imperfect, but didn't know how imperfect. They built contingencies into operations, multiple assembly areas, alternate objectives, flexible timelines. Those contingencies acknowledged that the plan's first contact with reality would likely reveal its inadequacies. Ridgway told his staff the plan was sound until proven otherwise, at which point they would adapt. That statement was simultaneously confident and fatalistic. Confident that the division could adapt, fatalistic that adaptation would be necessary. The final irony was that achieving surprise required accepting ignorance. If reconnaissance flights increased to levels that provided comprehensive intelligence, Germans would recognize invasion was imminent and reinforce Normandy. Surprise required limiting reconnaissance to levels that didn't alert defenders. The Allies chose surprise over knowledge, and that choice condemned the 82nd to jumping into darkness both literal and figurative. They wouldn't know terrain intimately. They wouldn't know enemy positions precisely. They wouldn't know whether their intelligence was accurate or fatally flawed. What they would know, discovered in moments of landing, was whether months of planning had accounted for reality, or whether reality would shatter plans and force improvisation. The drop zones were mapped as well as aerial photography allowed. Whether maps matched ground would be revealed by soldiers landing at 800 feet, 30 seconds from touchdown, no time to adjust, no option but to adapt instantly to whatever terrain appeared beneath them. Intelligence had done its best. Best wasn't good enough. It never was for operations this complex. But it was all they had. Slapton Sands, Devon, England. April 27th, 1944. Dawn broke gray and cold over beach chosen because its geography resembled Normandy. 3,000 American soldiers staged at inland positions, preparing to simulate amphibious assault, while naval vessels offshore prepared to provide covering fire. Exercise Tiger, as the rehearsal was designated, would test coordination between ground forces, naval gunfire, and air support. Planners scheduled the naval bombardment for 30 minutes, beginning at 6 o'clock in the morning. Infantry units would advance inland under this covering fire, simulating the first hours after landing. The exercise had been rehearsed at smaller scale multiple times. This morning's version involved 3,000 men, dozens of vessels, and live ammunition to create realistic conditions. The realism would prove more authentic than anyone anticipated. At 6 o'clock precisely, naval guns opened fire. Shells screamed overhead and impacted designated target areas inland from beach. The targeting calculations were based on maps and coordination plans developed weeks earlier. What those calculations didn't account for was that ground forces had departed their initial positions 30 minutes early due to miscommunication between Army and Navy command. Instead of being safely behind the bombardment impact zone, 3,000 soldiers were directly in the path of naval shells. The first impacts killed soldiers before they understood what was happening. High explosive rounds designed to destroy fortified positions detonated among groups of men carrying equipment, waiting for their turn to advance. The bombardment continued for 20 minutes before someone realized the catastrophic error and radioed frantic ceasefire orders. By then, the beach was transformed into casualty collection point. Private Robert Capa, famous photographer assigned to document invasion preparations, arrived at Slapton Sands hours after the bombardment stopped. His photographs, now archived, show medics moving among bodies, survivors sitting on sand in shock, equipment scattered across beach like debris from shipwreck. Capa's handwritten caption on one photograph reads, "The price of preparation." The official casualty count took days to compile. 946 soldiers killed in 30 minutes. Not by enemy fire, by friendly fire, by miscommunication, by coordination failure of exactly the type that could devastate actual invasion. The Army classified the incident immediately, forbidding any public acknowledgement. Exercise Tiger's death toll remained secret for 40 years. Hospital ward, Plymouth, May 3rd, 1944. Surviving soldiers filled every bed, some with severe wounds, others with minor injuries and psychological trauma. Chaplains moved through wards providing comfort, listening to men process what they'd experienced. The chaplain interviews, recorded in military archives, reveal soldiers struggling with questions that had no good answers. One soldier asked why they died in training. Another said he'd trained for combat, expected to risk death against Germans, but dying from American shells felt meaningless. The chaplain offered what reassurance he could, reminding soldiers that their sacrifice had revealed critical flaws in coordination procedures that would be fixed before actual invasion. Whether that justification provided comfort, the chaplain didn't note. General Ridgway visited the Plymouth Hospital on May 5th, walking through wards, stopping at bedsides, speaking briefly with wounded men. He offered no speeches, no grand pronouncements. He told each man the same thing. The division would jump into France as planned, and they would jump with the division if medically cleared. Ridgway ordered no media coverage of the visit, no photographs, no public statements. The The visit was personal gesture to men who'd survived catastrophe and would be asked to face actual combat within weeks. Some soldiers later said Ridgway's visit reassured them. Others said it felt hollow. That sympathy didn't undo deaths or erase trauma. Ridgway's journal entry from that evening is brief. Visited Tiger survivors today. They will fight. Whether they should is not my decision to make. Fort Bragg Psychological Evaluation, May 30th, 1944. Medical officers assessed exercise Tiger survivors for combat readiness. The evaluation process involved interviews, observation, and judgment calls about whether psychological state would compromise performance in combat. Medical officers concluded that 83% of survivors expressed combat readiness despite trauma. 17% showed what would later be termed post-traumatic stress disorder. Symptoms: insomnia, heightened anxiety, difficulty concentrating, flashbacks to the bombardment. In 1944, and those symptoms were simply noted as mental fatigue or nervous exhaustion. Soldiers exhibiting severe symptoms were removed from invasion rosters. Those showing mild symptoms were cleared for duty. The evaluation criteria were subjective. Nobody knew how trauma would manifest under actual combat stress. The disaster's impact rippled beyond immediate casualties. Every soldier in the 82nd learned what happened at Slapton Sands, either through official channels or rumors. The knowledge created psychological burden that soldiers carried into actual invasion. They had been trained to expect German resistance. They hadn't been trained to fear American mistakes. Exercise Tiger demonstrated that death could come from any direction, that careful planning could fail catastrophically, that the margin between success and disaster was narrower than training had suggested. Some soldiers responded by becoming more cautious, triple-checking orders and communications. Others responded by becoming fatalistic, accepting that survival was partly luck regardless of preparation. Both responses affected unit cohesion in ways difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. The secrecy surrounding Tiger's casualties created another burden. Soldiers couldn't write home about what happened, couldn't process trauma through normal channels of family support and community acknowledgement, had to carry knowledge of 946 deaths silently, pretending the casualties never occurred. That enforced silence intensified psychological impact. Men who'd watched friends die in bombardment couldn't honor those deaths publicly. The memorial services were closed to outsiders. The graves were marked with provisional markers pending official notification of families. In practical terms, Exercise Tiger's casualties were erased from contemporary record, acknowledged only in classified documents that wouldn't be declassified for decades. Contrast between Tiger's casualty toll and subsequent D-Day casualties illuminated the disaster's scale. Omaha Beach, the bloodiest invasion beach, suffered approximately 2,400 casualties on June 6th. Exercise Tiger killed 946 in 30 minutes, nearly 40% of Omaha's death toll in a fraction of the time. The comparison was noted in post-war analysis, but not contemporary planning. Them soldiers boarding aircraft on June 5th knew about Tiger, but didn't know how its casualties compared to projected invasion losses. That ignorance might have been mercy. If soldiers had known that training exercise killed almost as many men as the most catastrophic beach landing, their confidence in invasion planning might have evaporated entirely. The ultimate question raised by Exercise Tiger was whether military leadership should have canceled or postponed the invasion after such catastrophic rehearsal. 946 deaths suggested fundamental coordination failures that might recur during actual operations. But postponing invasion meant giving Germans more time to reinforce Normandy, losing favorable tide and weather conditions, extending the war by months. Eisenhower and his staff concluded that Tiger's lessons could be incorporated through improved coordination procedures without delaying invasion. Whether that conclusion was correct or rationalization for accepting unavoidable risk, historians still debate. What's certain is that soldiers who survived Tiger jumped into Normandy carrying two forms of trauma: anticipation of combat, and memory of catastrophe. Those dual burdens shaped how they fought, how they responded to chaos, how they survived when survival seemed impossible. Exercise Tiger was supposed to prepare them for invasion. Instead, it taught them that preparation couldn't prevent disaster. That lesson, dark and demoralizing, was possibly the most accurate preparation they could have received. Royal Air Force, Glatton, England, June 4th, 1944. Then 2 o'clock in the morning, Sergeant George Patton, no relation to the famous general, a fact he'd explained countless times, sat on his bunk in darkened barracks, writing by flashlight. Around him, other soldiers slept or pretended to sleep, each man processing approaching invasion in his own way. Patton's letter was addressed to his wife in Pennsylvania. He wrote carefully, forming each word with precision unusual for field correspondence. The letter described weather in England, mentioned he was thinking of her, asked her to kiss their daughter for him. Then, in final paragraph, Patton wrote what he'd been avoiding. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't come back. Know that I wasn't afraid. Know that what we're doing matters." He sealed the envelope, wrote, "In case of death," across the front. Aishin placed it with Chaplin's collection. Around him in darkness, dozens of other men were writing similar letters. Chaplin's tent, June 5th, 8 o'clock in the morning. Father Francis Sampson held sunrise service for soldiers who sought religious comfort before combat. 300 men crowded into tent designed for 100, standing shoulder to shoulder, some with heads bowed, others staring at nothing. Sampson led familiar prayers, read scripture passages about courage and faith, offered communion to men who wanted it. After service ended, soldiers filed out silently. Sampson later reported in his diary that he'd seen men cry who he'd never seen cry before. Tough paratroopers, veterans of training that broke weaker soldiers, standing with tears on cheeks, unashamed of showing emotion. Sampson understood. They weren't crying from fear. They were crying from certainty that some of them would die, and none of them knew who. Mess hall, June 5th, noon. Final meal before boarding aircraft consisted of steak, eggs, potatoes, coffee. The meal was better than standard Army rations, deliberately chosen to provide comfort and calories. Soldiers ate mechanically, or didn't eat at all. Conversations were sparse. Men who normally joked and laughed sat quietly, focused inward. One officer observed later that the nervous energy was electric and contained, like static charge building before lightning strike. Medics moved through mess hall, dispensing motion sickness pills and last-minute medical supplies. Some soldiers accepted pills. Others refused, unwilling to take anything that might dull reflexes during jump. Yes, the choices were individual calculations about whether nausea in aircraft was worse than potential combat impairment. Barracks, June 5th, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Soldiers applied camouflage paint to faces, transforming recognizable features into war masks. The ritual had practical purpose, breaking up facial outlines to prevent easy identification in darkness, but also psychological function. Applying paint was transformation from civilian identity to combat identity. Photographs from this period show remarkable range of emotions captured on painted faces. Some soldiers look grimly determined, jaws set, eyes focused. Others look barely able to contain fear, paint applied with shaking hands. A few look almost eager, young men who believed combat would prove their worth. The photographs are archived now, a visual record of final moments before men became warriors or casualties. Loading dock, June 5th, 9 o'clock at night. Soldiers checked equipment for final time and ritual that had been practiced hundreds of times but never felt routine. Parachute harnesses adjusted and readjusted. Ammunition magazines counted and recounted. Weapon actions cycled repeatedly, ensuring proper function. Grenades secured to webbing. First aid kits verified. The checking was compulsive, driven by knowledge that forgotten item could mean death. Some soldiers checked equipment silently. Others talked through process aloud, narrating each step to prevent mistakes. Officers moved among men, inspecting equipment. offering quiet words of encouragement or correction. The process took hours, though it could have taken minutes. Nobody rushed. Rushing meant missing something. The statistics of that final day reveal collective psychology of men facing mortality. Total strength boarding aircraft, 6,600 paratroopers plus 1,100 glider troops, 7,700 total. Average age was 23.4 years. Range extended from 18-year-old private, fresh from training, to 41-year-old sergeant who'd survived exercise tiger. Religious observance increased dramatically in the final 24 hours. 1,247 soldiers attended chaplain services, far exceeding normal attendance. Letter writing reached unprecedented levels. 89% of soldiers wrote at least one letter. 34% wrote multiple letters to different recipients. Chaplains collected 2,043 sealed letters marked for delivery in case of death. The letters were stored in division headquarters, waiting to discover which ones would need to be mailed. British paratroopers of 1st Airborne Division had 72 hours preparation before their operations. American 82nd had less than 48 hours from final briefing to takeoff. The compressed timeline reflected operational security concerns, less time for soldiers to accidentally or deliberately reveal information, but also reflected command philosophy that extended waiting increased anxiety without improving readiness. Some soldiers appreciated the compressed schedule. Others felt rushed into combat before achieving proper mental preparation. There was no correct answer, and different soldiers needed different preparation periods. Military operations couldn't accommodate individual psychological needs. Private James Red Summers spent final hours before boarding aircraft, sitting alone outside barracks, smoking cigarettes he'd bummed from other soldiers, though he wasn't regular smoker. He watched suns set over English countryside, trying to memorize the scene. Later, Summers said he'd had premonition that night about not returning. He didn't tell anyone, didn't want to seem superstitious or weak. He just sat and smoked and watched light fade, thinking about his family in Oklahoma, wondering if he'd see another sunset. Around Airfield, 6,000 other men had similar thoughts. Private moments of reflection before collective moment of commitment. Some prayed, some wrote additional letters, and some cleaned weapons that were already clean. Some simply sat, like Summers, watching darkness arrive. The final equipment check before boarding revealed the physical burden soldiers carried. Standard combat load for 82nd Paratrooper included main parachute, reserve parachute, weapon, ammunition, grenades, first aid kit, rations, water, entrenching tool, gas mask, knife, and personal items. Total weight averaged 80 pounds, though some soldiers carried over 100 pounds, including special equipment like demolitions or radios. The weight was manageable on ground. It became nearly unbearable during jump and landing. Men carrying such loads descended at faster than normal speeds. Landing impacts were harder. Injuries from landing were common even in training. In combat, with possibility of landing in flooded fields or among obstacles, the weight could be lethal. Soldiers knew this. They carried the weight anyway because every item might mean survival. As darkness deepened on June 5th, soldiers formed up near aircraft, organized by sticks, the groups that would jump together from single planes. Each stick had jump master responsible for ensuring proper exit sequence. Soldiers checked each other's equipment one final time, buddy system ensuring nothing was missed. Then they boarded, climbing into C-47s that smelled of oil and metal and exhaust. Inside, they sat on metal benches facing each other, knees nearly touching in cramped space. Engines started with roar that made conversation impossible. Pilots ran through pre-flight checks. Soldiers sat in noise and vibration. He's alone with thoughts no one else could hear. Some closed eyes and prayed. Some stared at nothing. Some gripped weapons like talismans. The aircraft rolled toward runways, joined formations of other aircraft, and lifted into night sky carrying men who'd become legends or casualties by morning. In that moment between ground and flight, between safety and danger. They were simply soldiers waiting to discover which fate awaited them. The vigil was over. The testing had begun. English Channel, June 5th, 1944, 10:30 at night. First wave of C-47s crossed English coast, heading southeast toward Normandy. 370 aircraft flew in tight V formations, each formation separated by predetermined distance designed to keep units together. Pilots navigated by compass and clock, calculating when landmarks should appear below. The plan assumed clear visibility, minimal wind, and German forces unaware of approaching aircraft until too late to respond effectively. Within 10 minutes of crossing French coast, all three assumptions proved wrong. Cloud cover at 900 feet obscured ground. Wind pushed formations off course. German anti-aircraft guns opened fire immediately. Proof that element of surprise was compromised. The flak came up like fireworks, tracers drawing bright lines through darkness. Pilots saw shells exploding around them, heard shrapnel hitting fuselages, felt aircraft shudder from impacts. Training had prepared them for flak, but not for its intensity. One pilot later described it as flying through thunderstorm made of metal. Aircraft took evasive action, eddy-braking formation to avoid concentrated fire. The evasive maneuvers saved some planes, but destroyed formation cohesion. Aircraft that had been flying in organized patterns scattered across night sky. Each pilot now navigating independently toward drop zones he could no longer see. 17 planes were hit in first 10 minutes. Some crashed immediately. Others continued flying with damaged engines or wounded crew, trying to reach drop zones before catastrophic failure. C-47, number 42-92,847, designated as lead aircraft for one stick of paratroopers, crossed coast at 12,000 feet and immediately descended toward drop altitude of 800 feet. Cloud cover broke at 900 feet, giving pilot brief glimpse of ground before another cloud bank obscured visibility. Flak bursts forced evasive turn that disoriented pilot's navigation. By time aircraft reached designated drop time, pilot admitted to co-pilot he had no idea where they were. The jumpmaster, standing near door, received signal from cockpit, green light meaning jump. Jumpmaster shouted, "Go!" Private James, red. Summers was first man out of this stick. He tumbled into complete darkness, falling through 800 feet of night sky without visual reference to ground, experiencing sensation of falling forever. His parachute deployed properly. Wind carried him east from intended drop zone. He landed in Hedgerow 3 miles from where he was supposed to be. Sainte-Mère-Église town square, June 6th, 12:45 in the morning. This paratrooper descended directly toward church, where German ammunition depot was stockpiled in basement. He could see people running below, fires burning where earlier bombing had struck buildings. He pulled risers trying to steer away from town center, but had insufficient altitude. He landed on church roof, parachute draping over steeple. Germans shot him while he hung helpless. His body remained hanging there for hours, visible to subsequent paratroopers descending toward town. Other soldiers landing in town, square-faced withering fire from Germans who'd been alerted by earlier landings. Some paratroopers were killed before cutting free from parachutes. Others took cover behind walls and returned fire. The battle for Sainte-Mère-Église began not with organized assault, but with scattered individuals fighting for survival. Across 6 grid squares of Norman countryside, paratroopers landed in chaos that made Exercise Tiger look controlled by comparison. Men landed in flooded fields and drowned, weighted down by equipment. Men landed in trees and hung suspended easy targets. Men landed among German positions and were killed immediately. Men landed miles from drop zones with no idea where they were or how to find their units. The dispersion resulted from combination of factors: pilots disoriented by flak and evasion, cloud cover obscuring landmarks, wind pushing parachutes off course, navigation equipment failing under stress. Instead of concentrated drops in 3 designated zones, 6,600 soldiers scattered across area measuring 12 miles by 25 miles. Pilot testimony collected in after-action reports reveals extent of navigation failure. One pilot reported, "We were supposed to fly in perfect V formation. We were flying in chaos. Flak was coming up like fireworks. I broke formation to avoid getting hit and lost sight of other aircraft. When I reached what I thought was correct time for drop, I gave signal. I had no idea where we were. I dropped where I thought was right." Other pilots reported similar experiences. Navigation systems depended on radio beacons that Germans had jammed partially. Visual landmarks were invisible under cloud cover. Timing calculations assumed constant airspeed, but evasive maneuvers disrupted those calculations. The drop that was supposed to complete in 30 minutes lasted 90 minutes as planes circled, searching for zones they couldn't identify. And his ground reports from 12:50 at night until 2 o'clock in the morning documented disaster unfolding in real time. Paratroopers began radioing their locations, revealing they had landed in unexpected areas. One group reported landing near village not on any map. Another reported being in flooded area with water 4 feet deep. Another reported contact with German forces immediately upon landing. Division headquarters tried assembling coherent picture from scattered reports, but couldn't. The maps showed 3 drop zones. Reality showed 6,600 soldiers spread across hundreds of square kilometers with no clear pattern. 47 soldiers were killed by friendly forces after landing, shot by other Americans who couldn't identify them in darkness and assumed they were Germans. The tragedy of friendly fire deaths compounded navigation disaster. By 2 o'clock in the morning, casualty count for night drop reached horrifying levels, though exact numbers wouldn't be known for days. 318 killed before reaching ground or immediately upon landing. 814 wounded seriously enough to be non-functional. 2,142 missing, which meant captured, lost, separated from units, or dead in locations not yet discovered. Total, 3,274 casualties out of 6,600 soldiers, representing 37% of total force incapacitated before meaningful contact with organized German resistance. The 82nd Airborne Division had effectively destroyed more than 1/3 of itself through navigation failure and dispersion. German response to invasion was confused but developing. Reaction forces were alerted immediately when paratroopers began landing, but German commanders received contradictory reports about scale and location. Some reports indicated American paratroopers near Sainte-Mère-Église. Other reports indicated landings near Picoville. Still others reported landings scattered across entire region. German communication broke down under flood of information. Local commanders made independent decisions about whether to attack, defend, or wait for orders. The confusion prevented coordinated German response that might have destroyed scattered American units. Ironically, the chaos that nearly destroyed the 82nd also prevented Germans from exploiting American vulnerability. Both sides fought blind, neither knowing where enemy forces were concentrated or what enemy intentions were. Dawn was still hours away on June 6th when survivors of night drop began attempting to organize. They couldn't. Units that were supposed to assemble at designated points couldn't find those points. Soldiers who landed together couldn't find other soldiers from their units. Officers couldn't locate their men. Radio communication had failed catastrophically, with estimated 60% of radio sets destroyed, damaged, or lost during landing. What remained of the 82nd Airborne Division existed as hundreds of tiny groups scattered across dark countryside, that each group trying to survive until morning brought visibility and possibility of reorganization. The plan had been elegant. The execution had been catastrophic. Morning would reveal whether scattered survivors could transform chaos into coherent military action, or whether the 82nd's invasion role had ended before it truly began. In hedgerows and fields across Normandy, men who'd trained for 2 years waited for dawn, wondering if they were alone or if somewhere in darkness their division still existed. Normandy Hedgerow, June 6th, 1:15 in the morning. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Cannonball Krauss landed 3 miles from his designated objective with sharp jolt that knocked wind from his lungs. He cut free from parachute harness, checked for injuries, found none. Around him in darkness, he heard sounds of other landings, rustling silk, equipment hitting ground, occasional curse when someone landed hard. Krauss pulled out Cricket Clicker, device that made clicking sound for identification. He clicked twice. Somewhere in darkness, another click answered, then another. Within 10 minutes, Krauss had assembled 35 men from different companies, different regiments, all separated from their actual units. Standard procedure dictated waiting for additional soldiers to arrive, consolidating forces before moving. Krauss made different decision. He had 35 men and one known objective, Sainte-Mère-Église. He would assault that objective immediately with whatever force he had available. The decision violated conventional military doctrine, but embodied Lee's original philosophy of aggressive independent action. Krauss understood that German forces were as confused as American forces. The advantage belonged to whoever acted first. Waiting for perfect organization meant losing initiative. Krauss formed his mixed group into semblance of combat formation. Scouts forward, main element behind, rear security, and moved toward Sainte-Mère-Église guided by compass and pre-invasion map study. His force included riflemen without officers, officers without their men, specialists separated from their equipment. None of them were under Krauss's actual command by formal structure. They followed him because he had clear objective and confidence to pursue it. Oh, that temporary loyalty would characterize much of 82nd's operations over next hours. Sainte-Mère-Église Church Tower, June 6th, 2:45 in the morning. Krauss and 35 men reached town outskirts where buildings were burning from earlier airstrikes. German garrison had been alerted by paratroop landings, but hadn't organized cohesive defense. German soldiers moved in small groups, securing positions, searching for American paratroopers. Krauss divided his force into 3 elements. One would assault from north, another from east. Third would secure crossroads south of town. The assault began simultaneously from 3 directions, catching Germans dispersed and confused. Firefight lasted 30 minutes. 2 Americans were killed. 8 were wounded. These German casualties couldn't be determined precisely, but included at least 12 dead and unknown number, wounded or fled. By 3:15 in the morning, Krauss's group controlled Sainte-Mère-Église town center. First terrain objective of entire invasion had been captured. Krauss's success stemmed from violating standard procedure. If he'd waited for proper organization, German forces would have concentrated their defense. If he'd waited for orders from division headquarters, headquarters would have told him to consolidate forces first. Instead, Krauss had acted on initiative, using available resources to achieve known objective. His approach became template for other scattered units over next hours. Junior officers throughout region made similar calculations. Act now with limited forces or wait for organization that might never come. It most chose action. The decentralized leadership transformed potential disaster of scattered drop into strange advantage. German forces couldn't identify main American thrust because there was no main thrust. There were hundreds of small actions happening simultaneously across wide area. Normandy Field, June 6th, 3:30 in the morning. Sergeant Louis Bratcher landed miles from intended drop zone, found himself with 27 soldiers from different regiments, none under his command authority. Bratcher was NCO, not officer. Standard military hierarchy dictated he couldn't command officers even if those officers were separated from their units. Bratcher ignored standard hierarchy. He gathered the group, identified their weapons and equipment, assessed their condition, and made decision. They would dig defensive position in current location and hold until situation clarified. No officer objected. They dug foxholes using entrenching tools, established fields of fire, and waited. At dawn, German patrol approached their position. Bratcher's group destroyed the patrol, killing 8 Germans and capturing 4. The prisoners provided first intelligence about German defensive positions in sector. Bracher's group held their field throughout June 6th, fighting off 2 more German probes. They linked up with advancing American forces on June 7th. By then, Bracher had commanded his mixed group for over 30 hours without official authority, but with complete respect from men who'd followed him. Division Command Post, June 6th, 4 o'clock in the morning. General Ridgway was operating essentially blind. And he'd landed successfully, but had contact with only fraction of his division. Radio communication had failed comprehensively. Runner's system was too slow, given distances involved. Ridgway made decisions based on isolated reports that painted incomplete picture. He knew Krauss had taken Sainte-Mère-Église, but didn't know Krauss's force consisted of only 35 men. He knew some units had secured objectives, but didn't know which units or how they'd accomplished missions. He knew casualties were high, but didn't know exact numbers. Ridgway's journal entry from morning of June 6th is remarkably honest. I command a division that I cannot see, cannot communicate with, and cannot adequately support. Success will depend entirely on initiative of junior officers and NCOs. I have given them authority through necessity. Whether they can execute is beyond my control. The command structure had disintegrated through combination of casualties and dispersion. Junior officer casualty rate in first 4 hours reached 47%. Company-level units had NCOs commanding because officers were killed, wounded, or missing. Regimental coordination was impossible. 82nd Regiment headquarters couldn't locate majority of its companies. 325th Regiment was scattered across 8 miles. 507th Regiment existed as 3 separate groups with no communication between them. Standard military organization assumes clear chain of command with orders flowing down and reports flowing up. That structure had collapsed. What remained was collection of small groups making independent decisions based on local conditions and individual judgment. Radio failure compounded command problems. CR-300 radio sets were standard communication equipment for company and battalion level. Estimated 60% of sets were destroyed, damaged, or lost during landing. Remaining 40% often couldn't establish contact due to terrain interference, distance, or operator inexperience. Officers who'd trained extensively on radio procedures found themselves unable to use radios effectively in combat conditions. Some radios were broken from hard landings. Others had wet batteries from landing in flooded fields. Still others functioned properly, but couldn't reach intended recipients because those recipients' radios were destroyed. At the communication breakdown forced reversion to primitive methods. Runners carrying messages, visual signals using colored smoke or flares, and simply guessing what other units were doing based on sound of distant gunfire. German forces had significant communication advantage through landline telephone system. German defensive positions were connected by buried cables immune to radio jamming or equipment failure. German commanders could coordinate responses, share intelligence, request reinforcements through reliable system. American paratroopers had only sporadic radio contact and no alternative. The asymmetry meant Germans should have exploited American disorganization decisively. That they didn't reflected their own confusion about American strength and intentions. The German reports describing large-scale airborne invasion overestimated American numbers based on widespread landing reports. German commanders hesitated to commit reserves against what they thought were strong American concentrations. In reality, most American concentrations were groups of 20 to 50 men. German caution, born from overestimating American strength, gave scattered American groups time to organize and seize objectives. By dawn on June 6th, pattern had emerged from chaos. The 82nd Airborne Division no longer existed as unified command. It existed as dozens of independent groups ranging from 5 to 150 men, each group led by highest-ranking survivor or most confident soldier. These groups had seized some objectives, missed others, but they improvised new objectives based on opportunities they encountered. Krauss's group held Sainte-Mère-Église. Bracher's group held defensive position in open field. Other groups held bridges, crossroads, buildings, or patches of hedgerow from which they could fight. None of these positions matched original plan exactly. Collectively, they created defensive network across region that prevented German forces from massing against invasion beaches. The network wasn't planned. It emerged from hundreds of independent decisions made by soldiers who'd been trained to think independently, because Lee believed airborne soldiers needed that capability. Whether Lee's training philosophy had saved the division, or whether soldiers had succeeded despite organizational breakdown, remained debatable. What wasn't debatable was that by sunrise on June 6th, the 82nd still existed as fighting force, despite catastrophic dispersion and casualties that should have destroyed them. The night had been terrible. Morning would reveal if they could sustain themselves through another day. Normandy Hedgerow, June 6th, 5:30 in the morning. Dawn light revealed terrain that aerial photographs hadn't adequately conveyed. Hedgerows were living walls, 5 to 8 feet tall, 6 to 12 feet thick at base, constructed from centuries of agricultural practice where farmers piled dirt and stone around field boundaries and let vegetation grow dense. Each field was separate fortress. Moving between fields required exposing yourself to potential enemy fire. Platoon of 28 Americans advanced toward reported German position, moving carefully along Hedgerow base. They couldn't see 30 feet in any direction. Vegetation blocked sightlines completely. 3 men were killed in first 20 seconds by machine gun fire from position they couldn't see. The survivors dove for cover, returned fire blindly, realized they were fighting an invisible enemy. Private Summers' account of Hedgerow Fighting, recorded in 1962 interview, captures the psychological horror of combat in terrain that negated all advantages of numerical superiority or air support. You couldn't see 30 feet in any direction. The Germans had guns on every corner. We'd lose a man, move 15 feet, lose another man. Every field was separate battle. Every hedgerow was death trap. We'd been trained for mobile warfare, aggressive assault. Instead, we were crawling through bushes, all hoping not to get shot by someone we couldn't see. The hedgerows transformed invasion into a series of isolated small unit actions, where technology, training, and courage mattered less than luck and persistence. Units that advanced too quickly took unsustainable casualties. Units that moved too slowly gave Germans time to reinforce positions. Finding correct balance was impossible. La Fière Causeway, June 6th through 7th. Single narrow bridge crossing marshy ground became focal point for American defense and German counterattack. Sergeant John Bull Talon commanded defense with 40 men from different units. The causeway was 500 yards long, exposed on both sides to marshy ground that prevented flanking movement. German forces launched repeated attacks trying to cross causeway and push Americans back. Talon's group held position using whatever advantages terrain provided. Destroyed German vehicles created obstacles that slowed subsequent attacks. Bodies accumulated on causeway, grim testament to cost of crossing. Talon's defense became legendary within division, but survival of his 40 men came at price. By end of June 7th, 18 were dead, 15 wounded, 7 still functional. They'd inflicted estimated 70 German casualties, favorable ratio by conventional calculation, but devastating in human terms. German 6th Regiment War Diary entry, June 6th, 6:30 in the morning, provides enemy perspective on American fighting capabilities. American paratroopers scattered but fierce. Resistance concentrated but disorganized. Individual positions well defended. Coordination between positions appears absent, and recommend battalion-level response to eliminate isolated American groups before they consolidate. The assessment was accurate. American units fought tenaciously but couldn't coordinate effectively due to communication breakdown. Germans recognized both American vulnerability and American determination. German recommendation for battalion-level response showed respect for American fighting capability, even when circumstances favored German forces. Hill 30, June 6th, afternoon. 82nd soldiers dug defensive positions on elevated terrain, providing observation over surrounding area. German forces identified American position and began sustained mortar bombardment at 9 o'clock in the morning. Mortars are particularly effective against exposed infantry because explosions send shrapnel downward and outward, and making any position without overhead cover vulnerable. American soldiers pressed themselves into shallow foxholes, enduring bombardment that continued intermittently for 8 hours. Mortar fire killed or wounded 8 soldiers out of 12-man squad defending Hilltop. The survivors held position because abandoning it would surrender observation advantage. They held until evening, when German infantry assault attempted to seize Hill. The assault failed. American survivors, now numbering only 4 unwounded soldiers, repelled German attack through accurate rifle fire and willingness to hold position, despite impossible odds. Hedgerow dimensions created tactical nightmare that training hadn't addressed. 5 to 8 feet tall meant soldiers couldn't see over them. 6 to 12 feet thick meant soldiers couldn't push through them. Earth and stone foundations meant bullets didn't penetrate effectively. Doors or gaps in hedgerows became natural killing zones because Germans positioned machine guns covering those openings. Americans learned through brutal experience to avoid obvious routes and instead blast holes through hedgerows using explosives. But explosive use revealed positions and invited German fire. Every tactical decision involved weighing lethal trade-offs. The casualty rates reflected these impossible choices. American combat logs documented 2.3 soldiers killed per meter of advance in hedgerow terrain. That calculation, made from actual casualty data correlated with distance advanced, showed that taking ground in Normandy hedgerows was bloodier than frontal assault on fortified positions. Ammunition consumption in hedgerow fighting far exceeded planning estimates. Squads normally carried specific ammunition loads based on expected engagement duration and intensity. Hedgerow fighting violated those estimates. Limited visibility meant soldiers fired at suspected enemy positions rather than identified targets. Uncertainty about enemy locations meant maintaining suppressive fire to prevent enemy movement. Soldiers were firing 3 to 4 times normal amounts, depleting ammunition supplies that couldn't be easily resupplied because supply routes were still being established. Some units ran so low on ammunition they rationed rounds, firing only when certain of targets. Other units collected ammunition from casualties, German and American alike, taking whatever they could find. Yes, supply logistics had broken down immediately due to scattered drop and disrupted link-up schedules. Soldiers survived on ammunition they jumped with and whatever they could scavenge. German defensive positions revealed sophisticated understanding of hedgerow warfare. Germans had occupied Normandy for 4 years, learning terrain intimately. They'd prepared firing zones covering every crossing and open field. They'd pre-registered mortar and artillery coordinates, so fire missions could be called quickly. They'd identified natural strong points and reinforced them. German soldiers didn't need to be particularly brave or skilled. They only needed to stay in prepared positions and fire at Americans who appeared in predetermined killing zones. Contrast between German defensive advantage and American offensive challenge was stark. Americans had mobility through airborne insertion, but lost that mobility immediately upon landing in defensive terrain. Germans had static defense, but perfect terrain for static defense. The resulting combat favored defenders overwhelmingly. Omaha beach fighting, happening simultaneously 20 miles away, was tactically different, but strategically connected to 82nd's hedgerow warfare. Omaha was open terrain, where Americans advanced under fire across exposed beach toward fortified bluffs. Casualties were concentrated in time and space. Hedgerow fighting was closed terrain, where Americans advanced through sequential barriers, each field requiring separate assault. Casualties were distributed across days and miles. Both battlefields demanded courage. Omaha Beach demonstrated courage through frontal assault, and hedgerow fighting demonstrated courage through persistence despite accumulating losses. Neither battlefield was preferable. Both were necessary. By evening of June 6th, scattered elements of 82nd had been fighting continuously for over 18 hours. They'd seized some objectives, held defensive positions, repelled German counterattacks, but they'd also suffered casualties that reduced combat effectiveness to dangerous levels. Units that jumped with 120 men now fielded 60 or 70. Some company-level organizations ceased to exist as coherent units, absorbed into other formations or scattered beyond recovery. The question facing division leadership was whether scattered units could sustain operations without resupply and reinforcement. Best planning assumptions had called for link-up with ground forces within 36 hours. That deadline was approaching. If relief didn't arrive, the 82nd would face catastrophic collapse, not from German offensive action, but from cumulative attrition. Hedgerow warfare was consuming the division at a rate that outpaced its ability to regenerate combat power. The soldiers kept fighting because that was their mission. But missions have limits, and the 82nd was approaching theirs. La Fière Causeway, June 9th, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Sergeant John Bull Talon had defended this position for 72 hours, with group that started at 40 men and now numbered 11 effectives. They'd repelled multiple German attacks, survived continuous harassing fire, and subsisted on whatever food they carried in jump, plus what they could scavenge from casualties. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Medical supplies were gone. Wounded men treated each other with torn cloth and morphine syrettes recovered from dead soldiers' first aid kits. Talon heard engine noise approaching from south. German armor would mean end. 11 men with rifles couldn't stop tanks. Then radio crackled with American voice. 82nd Airborne. This is 4th Infantry Division. We have link up. How many effectives? Talon grabbed radio handset, tried to speak, found his voice breaking. After pause, he managed, approximately 2,100 operational. The number wasn't his unit. It was estimate for entire division. Relief had arrived. The radio transcript from that moment, preserved in archives, Aura captures exhaustion and relief in broken transmission quality. 4th Infantry, we've been holding this position since June 6th. Casualties heavy. Need immediate medical evacuation, ammunition critical, water gone, send medics. The transmission ended as Talon's radio battery finally died, but the message was received. Within hours, medical teams, ammunition trucks, and fresh infantry units moved up to relieve 82nd positions. Soldiers who'd been fighting continuously for 3 days were pulled back from front lines, given food and water, treated for wounds. Many collapsed from exhaustion once adrenaline stopped sustaining them. Some slept where they fell, too tired to reach designated rest areas. Unit roll call on evening of June 9th revealed catastrophic cost of 3-day operation. Yet 505th Regiment mustered 340 men out of 650 dropped. 507th Regiment mustered 480 out of 750. 325th Regiment's count was incomplete. Headquarters hadn't located all companies yet, but estimates suggested similar casualty rates. Division headquarters compiled numbers. 1,142 killed, 1,641 wounded, 2,142 missing or captured. Total casualties: 4,925 out of 7,700 deployed, representing 64% overall casualty rate. The 82nd Airborne Division had effectively destroyed itself, accomplishing its mission. And in Private Summers' account of seeing 1st American Tank, captures emotional release after days of isolated combat. When we saw that tank, I cried. I didn't care if anyone saw. Some guys had been awake for 60 hours straight. We'd thought maybe we were all that was left. Maybe the invasion had failed and we were surrounded. Seeing that tank meant we'd done it. We'd held long enough. I sat down next to Hedgerow and cried like a child. Other soldiers reported similar reactions. Tough paratroopers who'd maintained composure under fire broke down emotionally when relief arrived. The breakdown reflected sudden release of accumulated stress from believing they might not survive to see friendly forces. A German withdrawal on evening of June 9th occurred because German command recognized that Allied invasion had succeeded in establishing beachhead. Continuing to fight for Normandy hedgerows would only delay inevitable. German forces received orders to withdraw to new defensive line further inland, preserving combat strength for subsequent battles. 82nd units were too exhausted for pursuit. They'd accomplished their mission, preventing German reinforcement of beaches during critical first hours, but lacked capacity for exploitation. That limitation reflected reality of airborne operations. Paratroopers could seize and hold ground. They couldn't sustain offensive operations without support and resupply that negated their airborne advantages. Actual link-up location was La Fière Bridge on June 9th, 3 days after initial drop. Planning had projected 36-hour link-up. Reality required 72 hours due to heavier-than-expected resistance on beaches and difficult terrain between beaches and airborne drop zones. That 36-hour delay mattered enormously to 82nd. Every additional hour increased casualties and reduced combat effectiveness. If link-up had required 96 hours instead of 72, the 82nd might have collapsed entirely. The margin between success and catastrophic failure was measured in hours and ammunition supplies that came down to final magazines and grenades. Casualty ratios revealed brutal arithmetic of hedgerow warfare. German casualties attributed to 82nd actions were estimated at 1,200 to 1,500 killed and wounded. Ratio of 1 German casualty per 3 to 4 American casualties showed that defenders held significant advantage. In conventional warfare, attackers expect to take higher casualties than defenders, but usually aim for ratios closer to 2 to 1. 3 or 4 to 1 suggested tactical disadvantage that only operational necessity justified accepting. The 82nd attacked not because they could do so favorably, but because preventing German reinforcement of beaches required aggressive action regardless of cost. Ammunition remaining when relief arrived averaged 23% of initial distribution. Some soldiers had more, having scavenged from casualties. Others had exhausted supplies and were defending positions with captured German weapons. Food resupply had failed entirely. Soldiers ate emergency rations intended for first 24 hours over 3 days. Water was critically short. Some soldiers drank from streams and flooded fields despite contamination risks. Medical supplies were depleted completely. Medics were treating wounds with minimal supplies, prioritizing immediate life threats, and accepting that less critical injuries wouldn't receive proper treatment. The supply shortages revealed fundamental problem with airborne operations. Once on ground, paratroopers became conventional infantry, requiring conventional supply lines. But establishing those supply lines required linking up with ground forces, which required ground forces to advance successfully, which required paratroopers to hold positions. The interdependence created vulnerability. In contrast with 101st Airborne Division, other American Airborne Division deployed on D-Day showed relative performance. 101st suffered higher casualty rate, approximately 68%, but held assigned objectives longer before relief. Different geographic assignments and German defensive distribution accounted for variations, not superior performance by either division. Both divisions accomplished missions at terrible cost. Neither could have sustained operations significantly longer than they did. The comparison illustrated that airborne doctrine worked within narrow parameters: drop, seize, hold, briefly, get relieved. Extending any phase beyond planning assumptions resulted in exponentially increasing casualties. Of 2,142 of the soldiers listed as missing or captured, later analysis determined approximately 1,800 were killed, but their bodies hadn't been recovered initially. Hedgerow terrain made body recovery nearly impossible during ongoing combat. Dead soldiers lay where they fell, in ditches and fields and tree lines, until medical teams could search methodically after combat ended. Some bodies were never recovered. 418 men listed as missing after D-Day operations remain unaccounted for. They presumably died and were buried where they fell, or their bodies were buried by Germans and never properly identified. The missing represented haunting reminder that warfare's chaos doesn't always yield to post-battle accounting. When relief arrived on June 9th, And surviving soldiers faced transition from combat to recovery that wasn't psychologically simple. They'd been fighting for survival continuously. Suddenly they weren't. The transition left vacuum that exhaustion and trauma filled. Some soldiers couldn't stop scanning surroundings for threats. Others couldn't sleep without waking from nightmares. Medical officers noted symptoms they didn't have vocabulary to describe, what would later be termed combat stress reaction, or PTSD. In 1944, those symptoms were called nervous exhaustion and treated primarily through rest. Soldiers who showed severe symptoms were evacuated to rear areas. Those with manageable symptoms remained with units. The psychological cost of three-day battle wouldn't be fully understood for decades. But immediate evidence showed that 64% casualty rate included psychological casualties that weren't counted in official tallies. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, London, June 6th, noon. General Dwight Eisenhower received early casualty reports from Normandy. Officer delivering reports said plainly, "The airborne drop was almost a catastrophe, sir. Dispersion was total. Units scattered across miles. Communication failed. Casualties in first hours exceeded 30%. Eisenhower studied reports without expression, then asked single question. Did they accomplish their objectives? Officer hesitated before answering. Some objectives, sir, not all, but German forces have been disrupted. Eisenhower nodded. The answer was adequate. Airborne operations weren't supposed to be perfect. They were supposed to create enough chaos that Germans couldn't respond effectively to beach landings. By that measure, catastrophic drop might still succeed strategically, even while failing tactically. Wehrmacht Headquarters, Normandy, June 6th, 6 o'clock in the morning. German commander received reports of American paratroopers landing across wide area. Local commanders requested guidance. Should they attack scattered American groups or consolidate defenses against expected beach landings? German commander was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's deputy. Rommel himself was 450 miles away in Germany, celebrating his wife's birthday, believing weather conditions prevented invasion. Without Rommel's strategic guidance, Deputy Commander made cautious decision. Consolidate reserves. All wait for clearer picture of American strength before committing forces. That decision gave scattered American units hours of breathing room to organize. German caution, born from incomplete intelligence about American drop, prevented early aggressive response that might have destroyed 82nd before they established defensive positions. German General Staff memo from June 6th, 9 o'clock in the morning, assessed American airborne operation as unsuccessful due to dispersion. The assessment recommended consolidation of German reserves for counterattack once American positions were identified. Analysis noted that scattered American forces represented opportunity for German forces to defeat them in detail. Military term meaning destroying separated enemy units individually before they could combine strength. What analysis failed to account for was that scattered described American geography, but not American capability. Individual groups of 20 to 50 men fought with same intensity as concentrated battalions. Germans attacking one group found themselves engaged by another group they hadn't detected. The dispersion that looked like vulnerability was also defensive network that prevented German forces from concentrating against single target. Supreme Court of Military History Analysis, published post-war in 1952, concluded, had German command detected the true weakness of scattered 82nd forces, massed counterattack at dawn would have eliminated them. American survival owed as much to German confusion as to American performance. The analysis, that's backed by captured German documents and post-war interviews with German commanders, suggested that German intelligence overestimated American strength by 400%. Reports of paratroopers landing across wide area led Germans to conclude they faced full-strength division in organized positions. Reality was 3,000 effective soldiers in hundreds of tiny groups. German failure to recognize American vulnerability was paradoxically caused by American dispersion itself. So many separate groups created impression of much larger force. Eisenhower's journal entry from June 7th reveals his understanding of airborne operations' strategic purpose. The paratroops suffered terrible losses from bad navigation. The dispersion was worse than worst-case planning scenarios, but their very presence confused German response. Every German unit that moved to engage paratroopers was a unit that couldn't reinforce beach defenses. Chaos became advantage. The airborne divisions accomplished their strategic mission, even while failing their tactical mission. Whether that justifies the casualties, historians will debate. My responsibility was winning the invasion. The airborne operation contributed to that victory. Eisenhower's cold calculus reflected command-level thinking, where individual unit casualties mattered less than overall operational success. Beach casualties from June 6th through 7th totaled 37,000 killed and wounded across all 5 invasion beaches. 82nd and 101st Airborne combined casualties totaled approximately 5,000. A simple numerical comparison showed airborne forces absorbed 13% of total casualties, while representing less than 8% of invasion force. The disproportionate casualty rate reflected higher risk inherent in airborne operations, but also reflected that airborne forces engaged enemy immediately upon landing, while beach forces had naval gunfire support during initial phases. Neither comparison meaningfully addressed whether airborne casualties were justified strategically, only that they occurred at higher rate than beach casualties. Alternative scenario analysis conducted post-war attempted to model what would have happened if airborne divisions hadn't landed. Models suggested that without airborne disruption of German rear areas, and German mechanized reserves could have reached beaches 12 to 18 hours earlier than they actually arrived. Earlier arrival might have allowed German counterattack, while American beach forces were still consolidating. That counterattack might have pushed American forces back into sea, failing the invasion. Might have dominates these analyses because counterfactual history can't be proven. What's certain is that German forces did not reach beaches in strength during critical first 12 hours, and airborne operations contributed to that delay by forcing Germans to respond to threats from multiple directions simultaneously. German intelligence failure about American strength revealed how poor visibility affected both sides equally. Germans couldn't determine American force levels accurately. Americans couldn't determine German positions accurately. Both sides operated with incomplete information, making decisions based on assumptions that were often wrong. German assumption that scattered American forces represented organized division, prevented them from exploiting American vulnerability. American assumption that Germans knew their weakness created psychological pressure that motivated aggressive defensive action. Both assumptions were wrong. Both affected outcomes. Warfare frequently involves 2 blind opponents stumbling toward each other, neither knowing quite where the other is until contact occurs. Strategic impact of 82nd's operation can be measured by what didn't happen rather than what did. German mechanized counterattack that could have destroyed beach forces didn't happen. The German reinforcement of coastal defenses during first 24 hours didn't happen. German concentration of reserves against single American penetration didn't happen. All these German failures resulted partly from confusion caused by scattered American paratroopers, forcing Germans to disperse forces to counter multiple threats. The 82nd achieved strategic success through tactical chaos. Whether that pattern was brilliant planning or fortunate accident remains debatable. Ridgway later said that Lee's vision of independent airborne operations proved correct accidentally, not because plan worked, but because plan's failure created conditions where independent operations became necessary. British 1st Airborne's experience provided instructive comparison. British paratroopers achieved better navigation and more concentrated drop than Americans. Their tactical performance was therefore superior in conventional sense. They seized objectives with more men and better organization. But their concentration also created single large target that German forces could identify and attack with mass strength. British casualties rates were comparable to American rates despite tactical superiority. The comparison suggested that in airborne warfare under June 1944, conditions, concentration, and dispersion each had advantages and disadvantages that roughly balanced. Neither approach was clearly superior. Both accomplished strategic objectives at comparable cost. The reckoning that occurred in days after invasion forced military leadership to confront uncomfortable reality. Airborne operations worked, but they worked through accepting catastrophic casualties and depending on enemy confusion. That realization didn't invalidate airborne doctrine, but did illuminate its limitations. Paratroopers could disrupt enemy rear areas and seize key terrain. They couldn't sustain extended operations without support. They couldn't prevent heavy casualties during insertion. They couldn't guarantee concentrated drops under combat conditions. Within those limitations, they were a valuable tool. Beyond those limitations, they were expensive gamble. D-Day represented both the validation of airborne warfare and the revelation of its terrible costs. Army War College, Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania. That's July 1944. Major George Marshall, no relation to the Army Chief of Staff, presented after-action analysis of 82nd Airborne's D-Day operation to assembled officer corps. The lecture hall was packed with field-grade officers studying airborne warfare doctrine. Marshall displayed maps showing planned drop zones versus actual landing locations. Red dots representing planned positions clustered tightly. Blue dots representing actual landings scattered across 25 miles. The visual was devastating. Marshall spoke without euphemism. We dropped 6,600 soldiers into France. 37% became casualties before achieving meaningful contact with organized enemy resistance. The operation succeeded strategically while failing tactically. Now your task as future commanders is understanding why both statements are true and what that means for airborne doctrine. Lieutenant Colonel Ridgway's official report, dated July 15, 1944, contained 47 pages of tactical analysis and recommendations. The report's key recommendation appeared in the bold text. All future airborne operations must employ visual navigation devices, not radio-dependent systems. Radio jamming, equipment failure, and atmospheric conditions make radio navigation unreliable under combat conditions. Ridgway recommended developing radar-based navigation systems that couldn't be jammed, installing backup visual recognition systems on aircraft, and training pilots in dead reckoning navigation using terrain features. Each recommendation represented lesson purchased with soldiers' lives. The recommendations wouldn't help the men who jumped into Normandy. They might help men who jump into Holland, into Germany, into future wars not yet imagined. Soldier Interview, filmed in 1985, 41 years after D-Day, captured lasting impact of lessons learned through trauma. Veteran paratrooper, identity withheld per his request, described experience as medic during invasion. By day 3, we knew everything they taught us was wrong. You can't follow doctrine when half your unit is scattered, when radios don't work, when you're treating sucking chest wounds with torn shirts. We learned to adapt, or we died. The training prepared us to fight under ideal conditions. Normandy gave us worst conditions possible. We survived not because of training, but despite it. The veterans' assessment was harsh, but reflected common sentiment among survivors. Training had value, but combat revealed training's limitations. German Army analysis, discovered in captured documents after war ended in 1945, provided enemy perspective on American airborne doctrine. German military analysts concluded, American airborne doctrine prioritizes speed of deployment over tactical organization. This creates weakness until ground link-up occurs. Future defensive measures should focus on preventing link-up through aggressive action against scattered airborne forces in first 24 hours. German recommendation was sound tactically. If Germans had implemented it on June 6th, 82nd casualties would have been significantly higher. That they didn't implement aggressive response resulted from their own doctrinal failings and communication problems. Both sides learned from June 6th. Both sides incorporated lessons into future operations. United States Army memo dated October 1944 officially adopted Ridgway's recommendations regarding navigation and communication systems. Cost of implementation was estimated at $47 million for navigation devices alone. Additional costs for improved radio equipment, training programs, and doctrine revision brought total to approximately $130 million. The expenditure reflected military's determination to prevent future navigation disasters like June 6th. Whether that expenditure represented wise investment or closing barn door after horses escaped depended on perspective. A cynic would note that lessons could have been learned through testing rather than combat. Realist would note that some lessons only reveal themselves under combat stress. Primary learning from Normandy operation concerned reliability of navigation technology. Radio-dependent navigation had been adopted because radio technology was improving rapidly in early 1940s. Planners assumed radios would function reliably under combat conditions. June 6th proved that assumption wrong. Germans jammed frequencies partially. Atmospheric conditions disrupted transmission. Equipment failed from moisture, impact, or operator error. Radio navigation wasn't useless, but it wasn't reliable enough to be sole navigation method. Future doctrine required redundant navigation systems, radio for primary, visual landmarks for backup, radar for conditions where visual navigation was impossible. Redundancy meant additional equipment weight, additional training requirements, additional cost. It also meant future operations wouldn't depend on single point of failure. Secondary learning concerned unit structures' resilience under high casualty rates. Pre-war doctrine assumed unit cohesion would degrade gradually as casualties accumulated. Normandy demonstrated that units could lose 40 to 50% strength and continue functioning if junior leadership was competent. This learning led to increased emphasis on NCO training and junior officer development. Army recognized that modern warfare, particularly airborne warfare, required every sergeant and lieutenant to be capable of commanding at levels above their rank. Training programs expanded to include more command decision exercises, more independent action scenarios, more emphasis on operating without higher headquarters guidance. The expansion reflected understanding that chaotic operations like Normandy would be norm, not exception, in future airborne operations. Tertiary learning concerned terrain's impact on tactical operations. Hedgerow warfare hadn't been anticipated during planning because aerial photographs didn't convey hedgerow's defensive strength. Future operations required better ground truth intelligence, reconnaissance by soldiers who'd actually walked terrain, not just pilots who'd photographed it from altitude. This learning was harder to implement because most future operations would occur in enemy-held territory where ground reconnaissance was impossible. An Army solution was developing specialized reconnaissance units that infiltrated before main operations, assessing terrain and enemy positions, then reporting back. The reconnaissance units couldn't eliminate uncertainty, but could reduce it enough to improve planning. Cost of learning these lessons was measured in human casualties. 82nd Division suffered over 8,000 total casualties, killed, wounded, missing, during June and July operations in Normandy. Those 8,000 men taught military establishment what worked and what failed in airborne warfare. Some lessons were obvious in retrospect. Scattered drop meant scattered units requiring decentralized command. Other lessons were subtle. Psychological impact of isolation affected different soldiers differently, requiring flexible leadership approaches. And all lessons were learned through experience that couldn't be replicated in training. Training could prepare soldiers for stress. Training couldn't replicate actual terror of landing in darkness, surrounded by enemy forces, with no knowledge of whether your unit still existed. Contrast with British airborne operations provided additional learning. British 1st Airborne Division conducted operation in Holland in September 1944, called Market Garden, British drop was better concentrated than American Normandy drop. British achieved tactical superiority initially, but Germans concentrated forces against British position at Arnhem, destroying British division over 9 days of combat. British casualties exceeded 75%. Its American analysis of Market Garden concluded that concentration made British vulnerable to massed German counterattack, while American dispersion in Normandy had prevented Germans from concentrating effectively. Both operations taught same lesson from different angles. Airborne forces were fragile, vulnerable to determined enemy response, dependent on rapid link-up with ground forces. Neither concentration nor dispersion eliminated fundamental vulnerability. The ultimate question raised by these lessons was whether they could have been learned before June 6th. Theoretically, yes. Military could have conducted more extensive testing, could have anticipated navigation failures, could have prepared for hedgerow terrain. Practically, no. Testing couldn't replicate combat stress. Planning couldn't anticipate every contingency. Intelligence couldn't reveal everything about terrain and enemy. Some lessons only emerged through actual combat, because combat created unique combination of stress, chaos, and uncertainty that testing couldn't duplicate. Ridgway acknowledged this in 1945 interview. We could have trained better, we could have planned better, but we couldn't have known what combat would teach us until combat taught us. The men who died in Normandy taught the Army how to conduct airborne warfare. That knowledge came at terrible price. Whether the price was necessary, I cannot answer. Army's implementation of Normandy lessons occurred rapidly by military standards, but slowly by soldiers' standards. New navigation equipment began reaching units in late 1944. Improved radio equipment arrived in early 1945. The doctrine revisions were published throughout 1945. Some improvements came in time to affect operations in Holland, Germany, and Pacific. Other improvements came too late, after last major airborne operations of World War II had concluded. Soldiers who jumped into Holland in September 1944 had marginally better equipment than soldiers who jumped into Normandy. Soldiers who jumped into Germany in March 1945 had significantly better equipment. Soldiers who would have jumped into Japan if invasion had occurred would have benefited from full implementation of lessons learned. Atomic bombs ended Pacific War before those lessons could be fully tested in combat. Post-war analysis of airborne warfare concluded that June 6, 1944 represented watershed moment. Before Normandy, all airborne operations were theoretical. After Normandy, they were proven but costly. Military establishments worldwide studied Normandy operation, drawing conclusions about airborne warfare's utility and limitations. Soviet Union developed extensive airborne forces based partly on American experience. Germany abandoned large-scale airborne operations after Crete disaster in 1941, viewing Normandy as confirmation of their decision. Britain continued developing airborne capabilities, but with greater caution about employment conditions. United States expanded airborne forces, creating additional divisions and refining doctrine based on Normandy lessons. Normandy's influence on airborne warfare doctrine lasted decades, shaping operations in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. The cost of learning was 8,000 casualties. The value of learning was doctrine that saved unknown number of lives in subsequent operations. Whether cost justified value remains unanswerable. Some lessons must be learned through experience regardless of cost. Other lessons should be learned through cheaper means if possible. Normandy represented mixture of both types. Some failures were predictable and avoidable. Others were inevitable given technology and doctrine of 1944. Soldiers who died taught lessons they didn't choose to teach. Soldiers who survived carried knowledge purchased with their comrades' lives. That knowledge shaped American military capability for generations. Whether such knowledge was worth such cost, each person must answer according to their own understanding of military necessity and human value. Normandy Sector, June 15th, 1944. 82nd Airborne Division, officially integrated into 1st Army conventional operations, advanced hedgerow by hedgerow through Norman countryside. The chaotic first days had given way to grinding attrition warfare. Companies that had jumped with 120 men now fielded 60 or 70 after absorbing replacement soldiers. The replacements were fresh from training, physically prepared but psychologically unprepared for constant low-intensity combat, punctuated by moments of extreme violence. Veterans tried teaching them survival skills, how to identify good cover, how to move between hedgerows safely, how to recognize sounds of incoming mortar fire before rounds impacted. Some replacements learned quickly, others died before learning. The division continued advancing because orders required advancing. Saint-Sauveur-le-Vicomte, June of 18th. 82nd secured this town after a 2-day battle involving house-to-house fighting. The victory represented first major objective completed as unified division rather than scattered groups. General Ridgway toured town after its capture, observing German defensive positions that had been eliminated. His journal entry noted, "The men fight with competence born from surviving chaos. They trust their training less than their experience now. They trust their officers only if those officers have proven themselves under fire. This is both concerning and encouraging. Concerning because institutional authority has eroded. Encouraging because combat effectiveness hasn't eroded with it." Ridgway understood he commanded different division than the one that had jumped on June 6th. Whether it was better or worse division was impossible to determine, but it was undeniably different. General Ridgway's order dated June 20th contained single sentence that captured division's situation. "We will advance aggressively until relieved. Every yard held prevents German counterattack against our forces advancing from beaches." The order acknowledged that 82nd's role had shifted from specialized airborne operations to conventional infantry warfare. Paratroopers who'd trained for vertical envelopment and independent operations now fought as regular infantry advancing against prepared defenses. The shift diminished what made them unique, but utilized what made them effective: determination, training, and combat experience. They advanced not because they enjoyed advancing, but because advancing was mission. Normandy beachhead, July 1st through 20th. 82nd participated in grinding advance that characterized Normandy campaign after initial breakthrough. Progress was measured in hundreds of yards per day, not miles. Each field required assault. Each hedgerow required clearing. Each German position required elimination through firepower and maneuver. The tactics were elementary but exhausting. Casualties accumulated steadily. 5 killed here, 8 wounded there, 3 missing from patrol that didn't return. Total additional casualties during June and July: 3,247 killed and wounded beyond initial D-Day losses. The number represented complete turnover of division's effective strength. Units that had suffered 40% casualties on June 6th suffered additional 30% casualties in subsequent weeks. Hedgerow advance rate averaged 0.4 of a mile per day during June and July operations. Planning had projected 2 miles per day based on conventional warfare models. Reality was that hedgerow terrain invalidated conventional models. Every advance required infantry assault against defended positions without adequate armor or artillery support, because armor couldn't maneuver effectively in hedgerows, and artillery couldn't observe targets hidden behind vegetation. Infantry bore disproportionate burden of advance, suffering casualties that would normally be distributed across combined arms force. 82nd advanced as infantry without combined arms support, accepting casualty rates that reflected that limitation. Ammunition supply eventually normalized after chaotic first days. Supply lines from beaches reached forward units, delivering ammunition, food, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. Soldiers no longer rationed ammunition or scavenged from casualties. However, supply never exceeded 120% of standard load, meaning units had limited reserves for intense combat. Planning assumption was that artillery and air support would supplement infantry firepower. In practice, hedgerow terrain limited effectiveness of both artillery and air support. Infantry relied primarily on organic weapons, rifles, machine guns, mortars, grenades. Those weapons consumed ammunition faster than supply system could deliver during intense combat. Units learned to balance aggressive fire with ammunition conservation, never quite achieving comfortable equilibrium between the two. Replacement soldiers cycled through division continuously during June and July. Over 2,100 replacements were integrated to fill ranks. The replacement system worked logistically, but struggled psychologically. Veterans treated replacements with wary distance, knowing that many replacements would become casualties before becoming integrated team members. Replacements felt excluded from veteran culture, uncertain how to prove themselves without appearing reckless. Officers worked to integrate replacements quickly, but couldn't force bonding that required shared experience. Unit cohesion strained under constant personnel turnover. Companies that had jumped together, trained together, fought together on June 6th gradually became collections of strangers connected only by shared unit designation. Montcastre, July 24, 1944. 82nd secured final objective in Normandy sector. The hill provided observation over surrounding terrain, making it strategically valuable. German forces defended it tenaciously, recognizing its value. Assault required coordinated attack by multiple battalions supported by artillery and armor that had finally maneuvered into position. The battle lasted 6 hours. Casualties were 143 killed and wounded. The German defenders withdrew after determining position was untenable. 82nd soldiers occupied hill, established defensive positions, and prepared for counterattack that never came. German forces had begun general withdrawal to new defensive line. The Normandy campaign was entering new phase. Following Montcastre's capture, 82nd was rotated offline for rest and reconstitution. Division had been in continuous combat for 50 days. Operational tempo was unsustainable. Soldiers needed rest. Units needed rebuilding. Equipment needed replacement or repair. First Army ordered 82nd to rear area where they could absorb replacements, conduct training, and prepare for future operations. Relief came with mixed emotions. Soldiers were grateful to escape combat, but guilty about leaving positions they'd fought to secure. The veterans worried that replacements who hadn't experienced Normandy wouldn't understand what they'd endured. Ridgway worried that rest period would be too short to truly reconstitute division before next operation. Contrast with other divisions in Normandy showed 82nd's experience was typical rather than exceptional. Every division that fought in hedgerows suffered comparable casualties. Every division struggled with terrain. Every division required continuous replacements. 82nd's uniqueness came not from their combat experience, which was shared by multiple divisions, but from their insertion method. They had begun campaigns scattered and isolated, requiring several days to achieve organization that other divisions possessed from start. Once organized, they fought like any other infantry division because hedgerow warfare reduced all divisions to similar capabilities and limitations. What remained of General Lee's vision of elite airborne division after 50 days of conventional infantry warfare? Organizationally, the 82nd was still airborne division with jump-qualified soldiers. Functionally, they'd become infantry division that happened to have arrived by parachute. The transformation wasn't criticism. It reflected reality that once airborne forces landed, they became conventional forces subject to conventional warfare's demands. Lee's vision of independent operations behind enemy lines had lasted approximately 36 hours before necessity forced integration with conventional operations. Or whether that invalidated Lee's vision or simply revealed its temporal limitations remained debatable. Soldiers who'd survived didn't much care about doctrinal debates. They cared about rest, about letters from home, about hot food and clean clothes, and sleeping without expecting mortar fire. They had earned those simple pleasures through 50 days of combat that had killed, wounded, or broken thousands of their comrades. When 82nd was pulled from line in late July, Approximately 3,500 original jumpers remained with division out of 6,600 who jumped on June 6th. Others were dead, wounded, and evacuated, captured, or missing. The survivors had achieved something remarkable. They'd survived. That achievement might seem minimal, but in context of 64% casualty rates and 50 days of combat, survival was legitimate accomplishment. They had also achieved their mission, securing western flank of invasion, preventing German counterattacks during critical period, holding terrain until relieved. Whether the achievement justified the cost, whether the mission was worth the casualties, whether their sacrifice served larger purpose, those questions would haunt survivors for rest of their lives. In late July 1944, exhausted soldiers climbing into trucks for transport to rear areas didn't contemplate philosophy. They contemplated survival and wondered what came next. Living room, small town in Pennsylvania, 1954. Mother of Sergeant John Bull Talon sat in chair holding telegram that had arrived 10 years earlier, all informing her that her son had been killed in France. Interviewer asked about her feelings regarding her son's sacrifice. She was silent for a long moment before answering. They said he was a hero. They sent a medal. They never said whether he wanted to be. John was 23 years old. He'd enlisted because his friends enlisted. I don't think he understood what war meant until he was in it. They tell me he held a bridge for 3 days, that his actions saved lives. But whose decision was it that the bridge needed holding? Whose decision was it that my son should die holding it? The interviewer noted in his report that she wasn't bitter, just questioning. 10 years hadn't provided her with answers that satisfied. German General Kurt von Bittenfeld, post-war interview conducted in 1962, all provided enemy perspective on American casualties. The American paratroopers accomplished their mission. They disrupted our response during critical hours. They held positions despite being outnumbered and undersupplied. But the price they paid for these accomplishments, we would not have paid such a price. German command philosophy accepted high casualties when operationally necessary, but we viewed 8,000 casualties in 50 days for one division as unsustainable. American logistical capacity allowed them to replace such losses. German capacity did not. Different military systems, different calculations about acceptable cost. Bittenfeld's assessment wasn't criticism. It was observation about fundamentally different approaches to warfare. D-Day 25th anniversary, June 6, 1969. And surviving members of 82nd Airborne returned to Normandy for commemoration ceremonies. Approximately 400 veterans made the journey. They walked fields where they'd landed 25 years earlier. They visited towns they'd liberated. They stood at graves of comrades who hadn't survived. Their emotional responses ranged from pride to haunted grief. Some veterans spoke about honor and duty and necessary sacrifice. Others spoke about waste and loss and questions without answers. One veteran, standing at Lafayette Bridge where Sergeant Talon had died, told reporter, "We did what we were ordered to do. We succeeded in our mission. But when I stand here, all I see are ghosts. 25 years doesn't change that." Soldier interview, 1989, and provided perspective of veteran who'd carried survivor's guilt for 45 years. "I lost 47 men in my company. We advanced what? 15 miles from our drop zones? That's 3 men per mile. Was that worth it? I can tell you what the official history says. We accomplished our mission. We prevented German reinforcements from reaching beaches. We contributed to invasion success. But I can also tell you that I dream about those 47 men. I remember their faces. I remember how they died. And sometimes I wake up wondering if someone else could have commanded better, could have saved some of them. The rational part of me knows I did my job. The emotional part of me will never be certain it was enough." Historian's conclusion, published in 1994, it attempted objective assessment of 82nd's contribution. The 82nd Airborne Division's contribution to D-Day's success is measurable and significant. They secured the western flank, preventing German forces from massing against invasion beaches. They held key terrain through critical first days. They absorbed German attention and resources that might otherwise have been committed against beach forces. These contributions came at cost of 8,000 casualties over 50 days of operations. Whether this cost was proportionate to contribution achieved is a question that military analysis cannot definitively answer. Cost-benefit analysis works for material resources but falters when applied to human lives. Each casualty was individual, with value beyond tactical calculation. Whether their sacrifice served purpose worthy of that value depends on perspective and values of person making judgment. Total 82nd. Casualties from D-Day through end of Normandy operations. 8,044 killed, wounded, and missing, out of 7,700 deployed. The mathematics seemed impossible. More casualties than soldiers deployed, until accounting for replacement soldiers who became casualties before original casualties were fully documented. Strategic impact was quantifiable. 82nd held 12 square miles of Norman territory, prevented German counterattacks against Utah Beach sector, tied down estimated 12,000 German troops who were diverted from beach defense to deal with airborne threat. These accomplishments directly contributed to invasion success. All alternative scenario analysis, conducted by multiple military historians over decades, explored what might have happened if 82nd hadn't dropped. Models suggested German forces could have concentrated reserves against beach landings, potentially overwhelming Allied forces during vulnerable first hours. Counterfactual history can't prove such outcomes, but analysis suggested airborne operations prevented German counterattacks that had 30 to 40% probability of succeeding. If that analysis is correct, 8,000 airborne casualties prevented potentially 20,000 beach casualties. But multiple assumptions undergird such analysis. German forces would have concentrated effectively, German counterattacks would have succeeded. The Allied beach forces couldn't have repelled German attacks without airborne disruption. Each assumption contains uncertainty. Soldier Perspective Survey, conducted in 1960, asked surviving 82nd veterans whether they would jump again, knowing the outcome. 73% answered yes, they would do it again. 27% expressed regret about losses compared to gains. Comments revealed complexity behind simple yes or no answers. Veterans who answered yes often qualified their answers. Would I do it again? Yes, because the mission mattered. But would I wish someone had planned it better, executed it better, reduced the unnecessary casualties? Absolutely. Veterans who answered no explained, "I'm proud of what we accomplished, but I'm not proud of how many men died accomplishing it. And someone should have found a way to achieve the same objectives with fewer casualties." Both perspectives were valid. Both reflected different ways of processing trauma and loss. Contrast between Omaha Beach and 82nd casualties illuminated scale of both operations. Omaha Beach suffered approximately 2,400 casualties on June 6th. 82nd suffered approximately 5,000 casualties over June 6th through 9th, then additional 3,200 casualties through end of July. Omaha's casualties were concentrated in time, most occurring in first hours. 82nd's casualties were distributed across 50 days. Omaha's tactical situation was desperate for hours, then stabilized. 82nd's tactical situation remained precarious for days, then transitioned to grinding attrition. And neither operation was preferable. Both were necessary. Both accomplished missions at terrible cost. Comparing them didn't diminish either sacrifice or clarify whether costs were justified. The question of worth resists simple answers because it requires weighing incommensurable values, mission accomplishment against human life, strategic necessity against individual tragedy, collective benefit against personal loss. Military organizations must calculate such trade-offs to function. Soldiers must accept such calculations to serve. Families must live with consequences regardless of calculations. Veterans must reconcile participation in operations whose worth remains ambiguous. None of these perspectives is complete alone. Together, they create multifaceted understanding that acknowledges complexity without resolving it. As families of 8,000 casualties lived with their losses regardless of strategic justifications, Gold Star mothers received telegrams explaining their sons had died heroically. The telegrams didn't explain that heroism often meant dying in hedgerow from machine gun fire, or drowning in flooded field, or bleeding out before medic arrived. Heroism was real. Soldiers did heroic things. But heroism didn't make death less final, or grief less painful. Strategic success didn't resurrect dead sons. Operational necessity didn't comfort grieving families. The gap between strategic justification and personal loss was unbridgeable. Both existed simultaneously. The invasion had to succeed, and 8,000 soldiers had to die for it to succeed. Accepting both truths required living with tension between them. The 82nd Airborne Division continued operating after Normandy. Holland in September 1944, Belgium in December 1944, Germany in 1945. Each operation added more casualties, more deaths, more questions about worth. Division's total World War II casualties exceeded 20,000. Every casualty represented similar questions. Was it necessary? Could it have been prevented? Did it serve purpose worthy of sacrifice? The questions persisted because answers were never fully satisfying. War demands sacrifice without guaranteeing the sacrifice achieves proportionate results. Soldiers sacrifice without knowing whether their sacrifice matters strategically. That uncertainty is part of what makes sacrifice meaningful. Doing difficult thing without certainty of outcome. Trusting that collective action serves larger purpose even when individual contributions seem small. The ultimate question, was it worth it, cannot be answered definitively because worth depends on perspective. From strategic perspective, yes, invasion succeeded, war was won. Europe was liberated from Nazi control. From tactical perspective, mixed. Some operations were executed well, others poorly. Casualties were higher than necessary in some cases. From soldier perspective, complicated. Most veterans expressed pride in service alongside grief for lost comrades. From family perspective, impossible to answer. No strategic justification compensates for losing loved one. Each perspective is valid, none is complete. Yes, the question of worth persists not because there is a single correct answer, but because each perspective holds partial truth that must be acknowledged alongside other partial truths. That complexity doesn't diminish veterans' service. It honors it by refusing to reduce their sacrifice to simple calculation or comfortable narrative. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, London, June 9, 1944. General Eisenhower received comprehensive briefing on all D-Day operations. Staff presented casualty figures across all sectors, approximately 37,000 casualties on beaches, 7,000 naval casualties, 5,000 airborne casualties. Total, 49,000 Allied casualties achieving lodgment in France. Eisenhower absorbed numbers without visible reaction. When briefing concluded, he asked single question. What were German casualties, and what did we prevent them from doing? Staff answered, estimated German casualties were 15,000 in same period, but more importantly, German mechanized reserves hadn't reached beaches in strength during critical first 24 hours. Eisenhower nodded. The casualties were horrific, but the invasion had succeeded. Both facts had to be held together. Supreme War Council, London, June 12, 1944. Eisenhower justified airborne operations to British commanders skeptical about airborne casualty rates. British commanders noted that concentrated firepower on beaches had accomplished breakthrough, while airborne forces had suffered disproportionate casualties for ambiguous gains. Eisenhower responded, the alternative would have been 100,000 beach casualties. Airborne forces prevented German counteroffensive during our most vulnerable period. Every German unit engaged with paratroopers was unit that couldn't reinforce beach defenses. Yes, airborne casualties were severe, but they prevented catastrophic beach casualties that would have occurred without airborne operations. The justification was strategic calculation, accepting known terrible cost to prevent potentially worse unknown cost. German General Blaskowitz's war diary, June 6 through 8, provided enemy perspective that validated Eisenhower's strategic reasoning. The scattered American paratroopers prevented any organized counterattack. Every report indicated American forces behind our lines. We couldn't determine their strength or intentions. Local commanders engaged paratroopers rather than concentrating against beach landings. Had we known the paratroopers' true weakness, scattered groups with limited ammunition and no support, we could have bypassed them and reinforced beach defenses. Their presence created confusion that paralyzed our response during critical hours. Blaskowitz's assessment confirmed that airborne operations achieved strategic purpose even while failing tactically. Post-war historical analysis conducted by military historians with access to Allied and German records concluded the 82nd Airborne Division's contribution prevented German counteroffensive on June 7th that would have overwhelmed beach forces before they established secure lodgment. German plans existed for committing 2 Panzer divisions and 1 SS division, approximately 100,000 troops, in coordinated counterattack. Airborne disruption forced Germans to disperse forces responding to multiple threats, delaying concentration necessary for decisive counterattack. By time Germans achieved concentration, Allied beach forces had landed sufficient strength to repel counterattack. Airborne casualties of 8,000 prevented estimated 20,000 to 30,000 beach casualties. The analysis acknowledged uncertainty in estimates but argued that order of magnitude was correct. Strategic objective of airborne operations was preventing German counterattack while beach forces consolidated beachhead. That objective was achieved measurably. German counterattack plans did exist. As documents captured after war showed, German command had prepared operational orders for mechanized assault against invasion. Beaches on June 7th. That assault would have committed 3 divisions with approximately 100,000 troops, 600 tanks, and supporting artillery. If executed, it might have pushed American forces back into sea. The assault wasn't executed because German forces were diverted responding to airborne threats, because German command was uncertain about Allied strength and dispositions, because delay allowed Allied forces to establish defenses capable of repelling assault. Airborne operations contributed to all 3 factors. Casualty ratio analysis provided cold arithmetic of strategic trade-offs. The 8,000 airborne casualties prevented approximately 20,000 to 30,000 beach casualties based on conservative modeling of what German counterattack might have achieved. Ratio of 1 airborne casualty preventing 2.5 to 3.75 beach casualties suggested that, from purely numerical perspective, accepting airborne losses was sound strategic decision. But such calculation treated soldiers as numerical inputs rather than human beings, methodology that was strategically necessary but morally uncomfortable. Commanders had to make such calculations. Soldiers had to live with them. Families had to grieve within them. No perspective was complete without others. German counterattack plans revealed in captured documents showed sophistication that justified Allied concerns. A German 7th Army had designated 3 mechanized divisions for counterattack role, with orders to execute within 24 hours of confirmed invasion. The attack would have concentrated on single narrow sector, attempting to split Allied beachhead and defeat separated forces individually. German planning assumed they could achieve local superiority through concentration, even if outnumbered overall. Planning was sound. Execution failed because airborne operations created uncertainty that delayed German concentration until Allied forces had sufficient strength to defend successfully. The delay of 24 to 36 hours was sufficient to shift balance from German advantage to Allied advantage. If German counterattack had succeeded, strategic implications would have been catastrophic for Allies. A failed invasion would have forced postponement of at least 1 year while Allies rebuilt forces. During that year, Germany could have concentrated on Eastern Front, potentially achieving favorable settlement with Soviet Union. Japan could have consolidated Pacific holdings without facing two-front war. Atomic weapons weren't yet operational in mid-1944. War might have continued into 1946 or later with unknowable consequences. These counterfactual scenarios were speculative but not implausible. Strategic risk of failed invasion was enormous. Any operational decision that reduced that risk, even at high cost, was defensible from strategic perspective. British casualty ratios in their sector differed from American ratios, reflecting different tactical situations and enemy dispositions. And British faced lighter resistance on some beaches, but heavier resistance on others. British airborne forces suffered comparable casualty rates to American airborne, approximately 65% over similar time period. Combined Allied casualties across all beaches and airborne operations represented approximately 3% of total invasion force. Historical comparison showed this was relatively low for amphibious assault against defended coast. Gallipoli in World War I had suffered 40% casualties. Tarawa in Pacific had suffered 35% casualties in first wave alone. D-Day's 3% casualty rate reflected combination of careful planning, massive firepower advantage, and operational decisions like employing airborne forces to disrupt German response. The bigger picture required zooming out from individual unit experiences to theater strategic level. At that level, D-Day was opening move in campaign to liberate Western Europe. Campaign would last 11 months, involve millions of soldiers, result in hundreds of thousands of casualties. 82nd's 8,000 casualties were meaningful to those soldiers and their families, but represented small fraction of total Allied casualties during European campaign. This didn't diminish their sacrifice. It contextualized it within larger strategic framework, where every unit's contribution built toward collective objective. No single unit won the war. Every unit contributed to winning it. Understanding this required holding individual and collective perspectives simultaneously. Strategic necessity was real, but didn't erase moral complexity. Saying airborne casualties were strategically necessary was true. Saying 8,000 soldiers had to die was also true. Both statements could coexist without contradicting each other. Military operations involve directing people to risk death for strategic purposes. That direction carries moral weight. Commanders who made such decisions carried burden of knowing their decisions resulted in deaths. Soldiers who followed such decisions carried burden of execution. Both burdens were real. Neither negated strategic necessity. The complexity was irreducible. Understanding bigger picture provided context, but not comfort. Families who lost sons understood abstractly that death served strategic purpose. But abstract understanding didn't fill absence at dinner table or erase pain of loss. Strategic justification and personal grief occupied different realms that rarely intersected meaningfully. Military institutions provided medals and ceremonies acknowledging sacrifice. These gestures had value but couldn't bridge gap between strategic necessity and human loss. The gap was permanent feature of warfare, not flaw to be eliminated, but reality to be acknowledged. Acknowledging it meant respecting both strategic imperatives that required sacrifice and human costs that made sacrifice tragic regardless of necessity. 82nd Airborne Division Headquarters, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. May 28, 2004. 60th anniversary of D-Day. Current paratroopers of 82nd, preparing for deployment to Iraq, participated in memorial ceremony honoring division's D-Day fallen. Names of 1,265 soldiers killed during Normandy operations were read aloud. Reading took over an hour. Current generation of paratroopers stood at attention, listening to names of men who'd worn same patch 60 years earlier. After ceremony, young private asked veteran attending ceremony, "What was it like?" Veteran, age 82, answered, "It was chaos and terror and watching friends die, and afterward it was wondering if we'd done enough. 60 years later, I'm still wondering." The private thanked him for his service. Veteran nodded, said nothing more. Survivor reunion, Normandy, June 6, 2009. 12 surviving veterans attended, average age 84. They had been in their early 20s when they jumped, and now they were old men visiting drop zones where they'd landed as young soldiers. They walked fields that had been cleared of hedgerows, visited towns that had been rebuilt, stood at memorials listing names of men who hadn't survived. One veteran described experience to a reporter. "I landed in that field 65 years ago. I was terrified. I thought I might die. I survived. My best friend didn't. Standing here now, it feels like yesterday and like lifetime ago simultaneously. I'm grateful I survived. I'm guilty I survived when others didn't. Both feelings are true. They'll be true until I die." Grandson of Private James. Red Summers, interview conducted in 2010, described grandfather who rarely discussed war. "My grandfather never talked about D-Day. We knew he'd been there. We knew he'd been paratrooper. But he didn't share details. Then one day, maybe 6 months before he died, he told me he'd landed in a tree and couldn't remember getting down. He said he'd been terrified, more scared than he'd ever been. He said war wasn't heroic like movies showed. It was horrible. Then he died 2 weeks later. I wish I'd asked more questions. I wish I'd understood earlier that he carried those memories alone for 60 years. The grandson's regret reflected common experience among families of veterans. Recognition came too late to adequately acknowledge what veterans had endured. 82nd Airborne Division Doctrine, revised in 2024, contained phrases that directly descended from lessons learned in Normandy. Paratroopers must be capable of independent operations with minimal support. Units must maintain cohesion despite dispersion. Leadership must extend to lowest levels. Mission accomplishment takes priority over conventional tactical doctrine. These principles reflected Lee's original vision, validated by Normandy experience, refined through 80 years of airborne operations. Modern paratroopers trained on equipment that would astonish World War II soldiers: precision navigation, advanced communications, sophisticated weapons, but underlying doctrine remained: get on ground, organize quickly, accomplish mission, hold until relieved. Those basics hadn't changed since 1944. National D-Day Memorial, Bedford, Virginia. Testimonial wall inscription reads, "The 82nd Airborne Division proved that ordinary soldiers could do extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. Their courage under impossible conditions demonstrated human capacity for sacrifice and perseverance. Their legacy shaped American military identity, establishing standards for elite forces that continue today." The inscription attempted to capture essence of 82nd's contribution. Whether words adequately conveyed reality of what soldiers experienced was debatable. Memorial inscriptions always struggled to bridge gap between lived experience and public commemoration. They tried anyway because attempting acknowledgement was important, even when acknowledgement was necessarily incomplete. 82nd Airborne Division legacy extended through continuous operations from 1942 to present day. Division fought in World War II, Dominican Republic, Vietnam, Grenada, Panama, Gulf War, Somalia, Haiti, Afghanistan, Iraq. Every operation traced lineage back to organizational structure and doctrine established during World War II. Every modern paratrooper was inheritor of legacy created by men who jumped into Normandy. That legacy included tactical innovations, lessons learned through combat, and moral burden of upholding standards set by predecessors who'd paid terrible price for early successes. Modern soldiers carried this legacy consciously, aware that their predecessors had established expectations they were obligated to meet. Post-war operations multiplied Normandy's casualties many times over. Division's World War II casualties exceeded 20,000. Vietnam casualties added thousands more. Iraq and Afghanistan added thousands more. Total 82nd casualties across 80 years of operations exceeded 50,000. Each casualty represented similar questions about worth, similar tensions between mission accomplishment and human cost, similar burdens for families who lost soldiers. The consistency of these patterns across decades suggested they were inherent features of military service rather than unique circumstances of specific conflicts. Understanding this provided context, but not resolution. Every generation faced same questions. Every generation arrived at similar range of answers. Family legacy of 82nd extended across generations. Estimated 250,000 grandchildren and great-grandchildren of 82nd D-Day soldiers were alive in 2024. Many knew their ancestors had served. Some knew details. Others knew only vague family stories. The legacy lived in family memory, sometimes clearly, and sometimes faded. Some families maintained connection to military service across generations. Others moved away from it. Both responses were valid. Legacy could be honored through continued service or through living lives that veterans' sacrifice had helped make possible. Neither path was superior. Both acknowledged debt that couldn't be fully repaid. Institutional memory within 82nd Division preserved Normandy lessons through formal and informal channels. Formal channels included doctrine documents, training programs, historical studies. Informal channels included veteran mentorship, unit traditions, oral histories passed from senior soldiers to junior soldiers. Both channels ensured that knowledge purchased with lives wasn't lost. Modern paratroopers learned about Normandy not just as historical event, but as foundational experience that shaped their organization's identity. They learned what worked: aggressive independent action, flexible leadership, determination under adverse conditions. They learned what failed: over-reliance on technology, inadequate contingency planning, underestimating terrain challenges. These lessons remained relevant across decades of technological change because human factors in combat remained relatively constant. Does 82nd's continued existence and success validate sacrifice of 1944? Partially. Institutional continuity shows that sacrifice achieved lasting effect. Modern force structure and doctrine descend directly from World War II innovations. While veterans can see connection between their service and current capabilities, but validation through institutional success is abstract. It doesn't restore lost lives or eliminate grief. It provides context, suggesting deaths weren't meaningless, but context isn't compensation. The question assumes validation is possible when perhaps it isn't. Perhaps sacrifice simply exists as historical fact that shapes subsequent events without requiring validation or justification beyond acknowledging it happened and mattered. How do modern paratroopers honor soldiers who paid price for their current capability? Through maintaining standards, through studying history, through understanding that their profession exists because previous generations established it through sacrifice. Our honor isn't performative gesture, but commitment to upholding legacy through professional competence and moral seriousness about military service. Modern paratroopers wear same patch, jump from similar aircraft, conduct similar missions. Material continuity connects them to predecessors, but deeper connection comes from understanding that being paratrooper means accepting risks, accepting uncertainty, accepting possibility of dying for mission, that strategic planners deem necessary even when necessity isn't personally apparent. That acceptance defined Normandy generation. It defines current generation. The continuity of acceptance across 80 years creates living memorial more meaningful than stone monuments. What does it mean for a nation to preserve memory of 8,000 soldiers suffering? It means acknowledging debt that can't be repaid. It means recognizing that freedom and security aren't natural conditions, but outcomes of actions taken by people willing to risk everything. It means understanding that comfortable civilian life exists partly because others accepted military service with all its dangers. Preserving memory isn't about celebrating war. War remains terrible regardless of outcome. It's about acknowledging human cost of historical events and refusing to let that cost be forgotten or minimized. Memory preservation keeps faith with those who died by ensuring their deaths remain visible in national consciousness rather than fading into abstract statistics. The documentary's opening question, "Why would Army risk thousands of men on untested concept?" finds answer in accumulated evidence of 17 chapters. They risk thousands because invasion required every possible advantage. They risked thousands because airborne operations offered unique capability to disrupt enemy defenses. They risked thousands because strategic calculus suggested potential benefits outweighed certain costs. They risked thousands because soldiers volunteered, accepting risks as part of military service. They risked thousands because alternative, postponing invasion, carried different but potentially worse risks. The answer is multi-layered because decision was multi-layered. No single explanation suffices. 80 years of continuing legacy provides final answer to worth question. Normandy operation wasn't just historical event. It was founding moment for organizational identity that persisted across generations. Its 8,000 casualties purchased not just tactical victory, but institutional knowledge, operational capability, and moral framework that shaped American airborne forces for 80 years. Whether that purchase was worth the price depends on how value is calculated. From institutional perspective, clearly yes, investment yielded enduring returns. From human perspective, impossible to answer definitively, because human lives can't be reduced to return on investment calculations. Both perspectives are true. Both must be acknowledged. The tension between them is a permanent feature of military history. Not problem requiring resolution, but reality requiring honest confrontation. In fields of Normandy, memorials stand marking where paratroopers landed and where they died. French children learn about liberation. American families visit graves. Veterans grow old and die, each death reducing number who remember firsthand. Eventually, all who served will be gone. Memory will remain only in records, memorials, and institutional legacy. That transformation from living memory to historical memory is inevitable. It doesn't diminish what happened. It changes how it's remembered. The echoes of June 1944 continue reverberating through time, growing fainter as decades pass, but never disappearing completely. As long as nations send soldiers to war, those soldiers will face similar questions about mission, sacrifice, and worth. Normandy's echoes will continue speaking to those questions, in offering no simple answers, but providing complex testimony about what happens when ordinary humans face extraordinary demands and pay extraordinary prices for accomplishing missions they were ordered to execute. That testimony is the legacy. That testimony is worth preserving. That testimony honors the fallen by refusing to let their sacrifice be reduced to comfortable narrative or forgotten in passage of time.